Okay, the first thing is if Ann would call the roll and make sure we have a quorum either here or online. That's no fine. That's no problem. They took your deal.
They did. They did. Okay. Reed Williams, Dr. Cantu, John Agather. Hear him. Okay. Anaqua Garcia. I don't think she's here yet. Dee Dee got her stuff there. Congresswoman Villagran.
How about
Councilwoman, thank you. Thank you. It's been a long day already. Yeah, there you go. Peter. Thank you. Andy Castillo. Al Rodriguez. Michael Kinnick.
Online.
Okay. Anna Marie. Jack Hebden.
Here online.
Thank you. Wayne Eddington. Tony Edwards.
He's there, his chair's there, so
Okay.
he must have just gone somewhere.
Okay. Michael Sanchez.
Online.
Thank you. Dee Dee. Kurt.
Here online.
Thank you. Chris Fullerton. Dr. Femi. Dana McGinnis.
Here virtually.
Thank you. Jim Berg.
Here virtually.
Thank you. And Anita Ledbetter. She was not feeling well, so.
Okay. Okay, we've got all the order. The next order is the invocation. I mean, couldn't be a better person after all she's done.
So thank you for being here. Let's bow our heads in prayer. Dear Lord, we come before you and we ask for wisdom and discernment in our decisions as this body comes together to make decisions that will have impact on our community for years to come. We thank you, Lord, for the gifts that you've given us and the talents of everyone on the rack. And we ask you to guide our time together today. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Amelia. This lady, as she walks back, you need to appreciate all the numbers that she and her group have crunched for us. Okay, the next item is public input and comment. I saw Dr. McGuire. I didn't know if there was others. Okay, okay. Take your time. We're not in any hurry. We're glad to have you. Just. Yes. Yeah. Come on. Here you go, Dr. McGuire. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Meredith McGuire. I'm the conservation co-chair for the Sierra Club. I'm also a university professor who is working right now unpaid to help the people in San Antonio and the area understand what's going on with our utilities. I'm not going to read my entire original plan statement because I spoke to students from one of the high schools here this morning about climate action. And I just want to relay to all of you that there are a lot of very anxious young people who see how dangerous climate change is causing and how frustrating it is that they don't see any action toward dealing with climate disruption. And I tried to say, look, there's a lot you can do still, but I think that the people in this room are the people who should be doing the things that those young people need you to do. And that is make sure that you have a good generation plan that gets rid of the fossil fuels as quickly as possible, and that you work on ways to prevent the kinds of unfair rates that are being charged to the people who are using the least amounts of energy. It's completely unfair to them, and there's a lot of ways by which you could change things. I think that you should pay more attention to some of the issues that were raised in the report from the Rocky Mountain Institute about what San Antonio is doing wrong, what CPS is doing wrong with regard to preparing the city for climate change. It's really, really urgent. And in particular, I call your attention to the thing that was in my handout. I hope you got it and read it, and I'll give you a short quiz at the end of the period. But we need to move as quickly as possible to distributed energy resources, and that includes things like solar and battery storage. We need that right here in this city. We need to have microgrids so that we are prepared for those next closures of the grid. And I think it's especially important that we hold all of the businesses that are using the most energy, hold them accountable to reducing their usage and to paying their fair share for that. So I urge you to create a set of rates that really promote true steps forward for dealing with climate chaos.
Thank you, Dr. McGuire. It's good to have you back. We've got another speaker. I'm sorry, I didn't get your name. Pardon me? Ryan Weber. Here he is.
Thank you very much, sir. Well, hello, my name is Ryan Weber. I am a member of the San Antonio Climate Ready Technical and Community Advisory Committee, but I am here today only in my personal capacity, not a representative of that group. When San Antonio passed the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan in 2019 through the City Council, it came with the strong support of CPS. And since then, CPS has repeatedly reiterated its support for the principles and the objectives of that plan. To say it, this is not necessarily common in electricity or other power generations, and it should be noted repeatedly and loudly how positive that is for San Antonio and for its chances of accomplishing the objectives of the CAP. While the CAP identifies many potential opportunities to reduce power sector emissions in the near and medium term, its core principle is the achievement of net zero emissions or carbon neutrality by 2050. That's it. That's the game. All other targets that are listed in the CAP for 2030 and 2040 are merely interim indicators along a data plotted path to that 2050 goal. However, because the RAC stipulated only a 25-year modeling forecast ending in 2047, Charles Rivers Associates was not able to speculate on how these profiles will perform against the actual 2050 end goal. In their prior presentation, the use of the 2040 interim target was used as a stand-in for whether or not different portfolios were aligned to the CAP. Adopting any generation plan that achieves 2040 milestone targets, but locks in long-term emissions that will fail the 2050 net zero goal is not aligned to the CAP and jeopardizes the very credibility of CPS's stated commitment to the achievement of that plan. This committee, of course, has many different factors it must consider. So my only request is that when assessing the emissions performance of these different scenarios, you should either empower Charles Rivers Associate to extend their modeling to 2050 in order to identify which scenarios actually align to CAP's ultimate goal, or if this is not feasible, to evaluate each scenario's emissions performance against the 2047 equivalent along the milestone pathway, which again, because it's data, is charted out. 2050 and 2040, it's not a mystery what happens in the middle. There are specific targets for every year. They just aren't called out individually in the CAP, but they can easily be identified by the Office of Sustainability, who helped present the CAP. By evaluating 2047 performance against 2047 targets, we have a clear picture of whether or not each individual profile is aligned to the CAP or isn't.
Thank you very much. Okay, just a couple of words about the agenda today. We're going to move right into the Burns and McDonnell report. We want to remind each one of you that we've got two more, how do you say that? Two 2-hour sessions coming up with them. And then our next meeting is on the 6th of December, which is an open discussion among the members of the RAC. And then we will take up the vote on December 12th. Now, you've received a lot of information, okay, in the last few days. You've received the Burns and Mack evaluation, the peer evaluation of the Charles Rivers work. You've received some more information from Charles River, and you received a tremendous amount of data from Chad and his group. Chad is we're going to work him onto the schedule some way so that he can go through that. But in the meantime, that's very hard to look at that data in tabular form and so we're trying to get some graphs going that'll make that a little easier to work through. And it has to be, and he kind of has to talk us through it because he had to talk me through it and to understand what's in each one of those. So, you know, before any of you spend a tremendous amount of time on that, let's try to get Chad on one of the events, and we'll probably try to do that on the 2-hour sessions that we have with Burns and McDonald, unless I hear some objection to that. Now, so the first thing we'll do on the agenda today is have the report from Burns and McDonald, and I assume Devesh is doing that. So if he or whoever. That's the different presentation. They'll get it up here for you, Devesh. There you go.
Thanks, Reed. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Devashish Bose, and I'm a project manager from the Resource Planning and the Market Assessments Group within 1898. And we have, as part of our group, we have been doing the peer review works to help you understand the analysis that has been done by CPS Energy and Charles River Associates here. So today we have looked at the CRA's results on the reference scenario on the 9 portfolios. And we have also looked at input assumptions related to the various portfolios. We are still, this, as Reed just mentioned, it's a lot of data that we have looked through. We have looked through a lot of this stuff. We have been working behind the scenes, and we have had multiple sessions with CPS Energy and with CRA team to, we're looking at the data, asking questions, clarifying some of the things, asking them what the thought process was and what the data actually represents, so we get a better understanding of that and help you get a better understanding of the information that we have looked at. So we have been doing that, and we will continue to do that till the December 2nd meeting, December 6th meeting, which is going to be when we will present our final outlook of all the data that we for all the portfolios and all these scenarios. So today what we are talking about and what we are saying is what we call, the initial look at the data. It's still a work in progress. We are still understanding, but we have covered quite a bit of ground that we can share with you here during the presentation. So the presentation, the deck that we have here will be covered by multiple folks. I'll start off the presentation here. Then the load forecast section will be reviewed by my colleague, Alec, who is online. Then I will come back and talk about some of the other aspects of the data that we have received. And then John Christensen, who is good, my colleague, who is also online, will cover the technology assessments. And Brian Despard, who is here with me, will cover some of the assumptions related to the commodities and the risk assessments that were inherently done as part of the reference scenario.
We're going to give it a minute here. He's about ready to put your report up. And here we are. Okay, you're on.
All right. Thanks, Rick.
Oh, I just want to remind everybody that those two-hour sessions are on the 2nd of December. I didn't have that date, so please. Huh? They're virtual, yes, the 2nd of December, just like the earlier two, but I didn't give you that date.
Thanks, Rick. Next slide. So here are the broad topics that we would like to cover. So we would initially talk about the approach that was taken for this study, the modeling approach and how things were done and the thought process behind that study. Then we will look into specific input aspects of the study. So we will start with the load forecast, which we think is one of the key inputs to any IRP study. We will talk about a little bit about what we saw for the existing resources that were modeled. We will talk about the ERCOT market. So, and I'll explain what we mean by that here shortly. And then we will look at the new technology assessments, commodity price forecast, and risk analysis. All this from our input side as well. And then I will briefly talk about the reference scenarios results across the 9 portfolios. And one note, as we go through each segment, I will go through the segment and then make a pause. And if you have any questions for that particular segment, I would encourage you to ask those questions at that time. But even if you have any further questions, feel free to ask those questions later on when we are done with the presentation as well. So just to do a brief, cover what the typical IRP study approach entails. So when we are doing an IRP study, whether we are doing it for a utility like CPS Energy or when we do IRP studies for other clients as well, the So are you controlling? Okay. Who's controlling? Can we go back one slide, please? Okay, I got control. All right. So talking about the study approach. So when we're doing a typical IRP study, the primary goal of the study is to do an economic evaluation of the utilities power supply portfolio over both the short-term and the long-term horizons. So the key thing here is that even though we are doing a long-term study, we are in the main focus should be on the short term. And typically, and for particularly in this case, I understand that the short term is looking up to 2030, and the long term is looking up to 2047. So while the analysis is being done the next 25 years up to 2047, the main focus of this study, or the primary focus, is the next 8 years up to 2030. And this is typical of what we see and what we do for other IRP studies as well. So a typical integrated resource plan, as we know, is basically constituted of many blocks, as you can see. So the orange block here is that integrated resource plan that comprises of the different inputs or the different components that is shown by the different blocks that are around that integrated resource plan block. So in order to, when we are doing this, comprising of the different areas, so the different parameters or the different assumptions that go into the integrated resource plan, we do this and when we do look into this and with help of these assumptions, develop what we call portfolios, scenarios, and sensitivities, and then come up with the, do the economic analysis or the economic analysis and long-term planning, and come up with the prescribed or the preferred power supply plan. So that is in a nutshell what an IRP study typically does, and what that's the intent is to come up with the long-term power supply plan, which the focus on the short term. So when we do that, we do that through multiple steps. So the first step that we do is we develop what we call the reference scenario, and then we develop alternative scenarios. And I'll explain what a scenario and a portfolio is. And we develop portfolio strategies, and then we do sensitivities and distribution of outcomes as well. So scenarios are what we call situations or assumptions that are beyond the typical control of a particular utility. So those are external conditions that the utility does not control, but are likely to happen. So, so assumptions around different scenarios are developed like that. From the strategy side, or we can call that portfolios, as it has been referred here in this particular study, are different portfolios or different strategies that the utility can take or based on things that are within their particular control. And then sensitivities is basically when you stressing one input variable and trying to see how the portfolios perform. That particular input variable is being stressed or is changing under different conditions. And then we have distribution of outcomes, where we do, not always, but sometimes we do stochastic analysis around pricing and cost inputs to generate a range of possible outcomes and see how the portfolios perform through those range of outcomes. So this is a little bit of background that I wanted to share. Is what is a typical study approach for an IRP. And on this slide, what I've tried to do here is I've tried to bring that together and compare what a typical approach is and what CRA and CPS has done in particular to this particular IRP study. So the study they have analyzed scenarios, portfolios, and sensitivities. So scenarios, as you know, we have already looked at the reference scenario results. Today, the other three scenarios will be presented by CRA following this presentation. So there are 4 scenarios that they have analyzed, and those 4 scenarios are based on different different by varying the assumptions of different variables which are not within CPS Energy's control. And those variables are gas prices, carbon prices, technology costs, the demand, load and demand, and the ERCOT market design. In addition to that, along with that, for each of these scenarios, they've analyzed 9 strategies or 9 paths or portfolios. I understand some of those portfolios were developed by CPS and CRA as a team, and some of those portfolios were also developed based on inputs that were received from the RAC committee as well. In addition to that, there will be some sensitivities that will be performed on the reference cases. The 4 different sensitivities that will be performed. And as I see, particularly here, they have not done any stochastic analysis. Stochastic analysis typically take a lot of time, a lot of intense computing. And so instead of stochastic analysis, what they've tried to do here is they've tried to use the portfolio variations and the variations, portfolio definition, scenario definitions, and the portfolios and the input variable, the assumptions variables, the differences in the assumptions, and they've tried to cover the risks so that they conceive, right, through those definitions. So in our opinion, in terms of the approach, I think this looks to be a reasonable approach. I would say it's similar to approaches that have been taken for IRP studies and is being done by many consultants like us as well for other clients. And so I think the approach is pretty reasonable for this long-term study. So that's all I wanted to cover from a study approach. I thought it was important to cover the study approach to explain what is being done and whether the approach is similar or consistent with other approaches that we have seen. I would now take a pause here to see if you have any questions on what I just discussed. Hearing none, I would go on to the next segment, and this is on the load forecast. And I would request Alec, who is online. Alec, can you hear me?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, can you go through the slides? I have the control, so as you know, when you need me to move the slides, let me know. Okay.
Yep, sounds good. Thanks, Debashis. Hello, everyone, and thank you for your evening. As Debashis said, my name is Alec, and I'm an analyst here at 1898 & Co., part of Burns & McDonnell. I'm also part of the load forecasting team here, so I will be reviewing my observations and thoughts on the load forecast that was created by CPS Energy and Itron. So first, I would like to start by outlining the general approach that was taken to compose the load forecast. Two generally accepted and widely used methodologies were applied. The first is the use of multivariate regressions, which simply put, finds variables that influence energy sales. And if these influential variables can be projected, then you can also project the energy sales. The second is a bottom-up approach. Now, this breaks apart the system into components such as residential, solar, and other smaller forecasts. These components are then aggregated together to build the overall system forecast. Now, 1898 & Co., others in the industry, and researchers alike all use these methodologies when creating their own load forecasts. So for this reason, we consider this overall approach to be quite reasonable. Next slide, please. So within these approaches are slight differences between what was done and what 1898 & Co. typically does. Now, I want to preface by saying that this does not mean that one is more correct than the other, but they're just simply different approaches that have their own advantages and disadvantages to them. Now, the first has to do with the development of the peak. From my understanding of the summer 2022 electric forecast report, historical weather data is statistically correlated, normalized, and projected to find future peak loads and times. At 1898 & Co., we either project out the normalized load factors or hourly load profiles depending on the level of detail requested by our clients. Now, all three of these methodologies are generally accepted. The impact of a weather normalized peak is a larger dependence on an accurate weather forecast. Now, Itron and CPS Energy did put in a lot of effort to create as accurate a weather forecast as possible. But if these weather patterns end up shifting outside of what is expected within the forecast, then a new one will likely need to be created in order to capture these new weather patterns. What 1898 & Co. does is under the normalized load factor, we are presuming that the usage patterns will remain consistent throughout the forecast. So as long as cultural changes of when and relatively how much power is demanded does not change, then the peak prediction will continue to hold in the future. On the hourly analysis side of things, overlaying load profiles is also dependent on usage patterns kind of remaining consistent over time, but it tends to be well hedged against a lot of those changes since it's kind of breaking up that profile into various different components. Now, the second difference is the way on how growth is estimated. From my understanding of that summer 2022 report, historical lows, also known as minimum loads, are regressed to find an average annual growth rate. So this growth rate is then applied to future minimum loads. At 1898 & Co., we really do not apply or use a minimum load model due to our focus on using normalized load factors or the load shapes. We also tend to check that the non-peak system loads are generally growing at around or keeping up pace with the system peak itself, since typically the lows and the peaks happen to grow at different rates. The impact is that 1898 & Co.'s methodologies may skew the demand forecast a bit higher, while this use of a minimum load model may skew the demand forecast to be lower in the long term. Next slide, please. So after reviewing the materials that were provided to me, I created a small list of future considerations that I think should be implemented into the next load forecast that CPS Energy ends up creating. The first is not really an immediate concern, but we at 1898 & Co. and Burns & McDonnell believe and are seeing general trends of the residential and some commercial users kind of switching from natural gas to electric energy within their buildings, creating all electric homes for new construction as well. And while not a concern within ERCOT specifically anytime soon, we have started to see that some local governments either have attempted to or are considering the banning of natural gas for new construction. So at least in the long term, this might be something that CPS Energy wants to consider if these trends end up kind of moving into the Texas area. Now, I was informed that electric heating had been incorporated into the load forecast. I do believe a reevaluation of those projections, kind of both reconsidering a lot of this electrification and incorporating additional electrification from other appliances should be included into the future load forecasting model to kind of incorporate a lot of these different shifts that we're seeing. To the second point, which is actually quite complementary to the first one, is to factor in the growth and impact of solar, battery, EV, and energy efficient appliances due to the passing of incentives that we have seen kind of being passed with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed by our national government quite recently. I do realize the forecast was finalized before these bills were passed, but should be incorporated into future load forecasts to kind of see how those impact the future energy load of CPS Energy. The third point is a further analysis of the residential EV time of use and the DC fast charging load shapes. This may be a bit picky on our end, but at least for the time of use shape, there is a 1 hour shift in the peak, which is to be expected with these types of rates, but that this shift or difference between the standard charging time and the time of use time kind of narrows and realigns a lot faster than what we would typically see. So even though someone starts charging their car an hour or two later, we end up seeing, at least within this load shape, that they end up they're done charging at the same exact time as someone who had started an hour before them. So maybe just a reevaluation of those load shapes. And then at least for the DC fast charging, during the non-summer months, we see a 10 p.m. peak for those fast chargers. So I was told that this was based upon data that was collected specifically within the CPS Energy area. I will say this is something that we at 1898 & Co. have not seen elsewhere throughout ERCOT or elsewhere within the United States. So further analysis on that data, I think, is something that I would recommend. Then for the last point, this one is more subjective, but I do believe that the energy efficiency and demand response programs that were forecasted could have higher impact than what is actually put into the forecast. This is just based on a comparison of what I have seen with other smaller utilities that don't have as big of a customer base or load, what they kind of claim to be capable of doing with their DSM programs. But, since I am kind of picking on that, I will say that the actual energy efficiency and demand response forecast is still reasonable for the San Antonio and CPS Energy area. Next slide, please. So there were some questions that were sent several weeks ago from the committee, and I just wanted to make sure that these were actually addressed. So the first question had to do with population estimates. From what I could pull together from charts within the report, it appears that CPS Energy is projecting the city and their customer base to grow around 2% every single year. So this both continues a very consistent horizontal historical trend and also keeps San Antonio in the category of a fast-growing city within the United States. And I believe that this is quite reasonable. If for some reason San Antonio is going to experience any sort of growth faster than that, I think that would definitely need to be sort of analyzed and see what factors would be contributing to really an exceptionally fast growing kind of pace. For the second question, this had to do with EV peak demand estimates. I was also able to review the EV forecast that CPS Energy and Itron put together, both on how it was set up, and the resulting values do appear reasonable to me. The only discrepancies have to do with the load shapes that I had mentioned before. And when looking at the overall system forecast, as asked in the third question here, the system forecast does look reasonable to me, though it may be on the lower end of what I would expect a fast-growing city to experience, since there are other utilities that are in slower growing regions of the country kind of experiencing the same sort of load growth. So while definitely not out of the bounds of what could be expected, it seems to be a bit slower than what I would expect a city of this size and with this kind of growth rate in terms of population would be capable of. But those were the only three questions that I had really seen ahead of time. I'm happy to take any additional questions on my evaluation or the load forecast itself before we move on to the next part of the presentation.
Thanks, Alec. We'll take a pause here for any questions related to what Alec just talked about, the load forecast.
I have a question if nobody else does.
Yes.
So going back to your EV peak demand numbers, did you start with a certain percentage of penetration of the EV market? And as an example, my own research, just looking on the internet, said that the percentage of EV vehicles nationwide is about slightly over 1%. So if it's going to grow 20%, which is what you're saying, what the peak demand is what based on a 20% growth rate, and how long is it going to take?
Yeah, so I can actually pull up, let me see what the numbers were within their forecast. So CPS Energy was, they broke apart their EV forecast into several different sections. So they broke apart what they called EV light vehicles and also EV medium and heavy duty vehicles. So this kind of separates out the difference between what you would consider maybe your, your standard Teslas and whatnot that you would see along the road, and separates those with the big kind of semi trucks and other heavy duty vehicles. So there's different ways of looking at this. If you want to try to consider all of them, all the EVs put together. Let's say we can look at, is there a particular year that you're wanting to?
I'm just looking for a number that you started from, not some estimate in the future. What kind of percentage penetration did you start from? Look, is it 5%, 10%? What's the real number? That's all I'm looking for. So then what is then, if your theory says it's going to grow at 20% a year, if you start, let's just use 1%. That's the number that I got off but less than 2, but 1%. And if it grows 20% a year, next year it's 1.2%. And it's going to take a long time to even get to 5%. So that's the number I'm looking for, to put it in perspective. Because if we're dealing with this and spending money based on a certain percentage of demand from EV, what is that number? And should we be doing that now until the number gets bigger? I think we need some perspective here, and I have to have some real numbers in order to even think about it.
Sure. Yeah. So just looking at the forecast that was presented, they actually do start out with 1 megawatt, looking at all EVs put together. But this 20% is a compound annual growth rate, mostly looking between now and about 2040 and beyond. So with the compounding effect that it's kind of capturing a lot of what we would see as the adoption rate sort of curve. So at the beginning, it is a little bit difficult, right? We've seen really the EVs not kind of slowly gathering traction. And I think we're at this point now where there's going to be, a very quick explosion of growth, especially with a lot of the incentives that are coming on. So while 20% is the compound annual growth rate, we expect to see a lot of this growth kind of taking off pretty soon.
Well, okay, say you're right there, but you gave me a number of 1 megawatt, but that doesn't give me a penetration or percentage of EV vehicles that actually exist now, to put it in perspective. And what is 1 megawatt? What's the generation capacity with all generation sources of CPS right now? If it starts at 1, what's the total megawatts that CPS has? Both.
That I'm not aware of.
Well, but you should be. And so then you have to go back and say, what's the percentage of cars? And I'm not even sure I'm right, but going on the internet, if the EV percentage of cars in America is 1%, I mean, we have to make a decision. Why should we spend money, or should we spend money to put in a bunch of charging stations for 1% of the people? That's no different from, you just giving money to the rich folks. To put it simply, that's why I'm looking for a number. And it doesn't do the rack, and of course, me either. If you just say it's going to grow at 20%, that's alarming. But if you're starting at a 1% growth rate, it's going to take a while before you even get to 5%.
Dana, we're gonna get you some better numbers on that from CPS, because you're right. If we're starting from a very low base, it's not going to have a very large impact on our demand curve. So let us get offline. We're not really talking about charging stations. We're talking about demand curve, and we'll take a look at that. Looks like we need to do a little work on that, Dana. Okay.
Well, I agree, but you're talking about both things: charging stations and then need for power down the road. And
No.
so you need to give us those kind of numbers.
Well, we'll get them for you, but we obviously, I'm not seeing any numbers come forward here in the room. So let's take a minute. Now, we got FEMI's next. We'll get them for you, Dane.
On your slide 10, where you talk about load forecasts, the approach, and slide 11, and this is just a basic methodology question. When you present those two approaches, are you referring to them as methods that CPS Energy stroke CRA has used, or are they options? Because your comments at the end says the method and assumptions used by CPS is reasonable. What method are you referring to?
Yes, so that would be the two methodologies were the use of a multivariate regression, and then that would also be for the kind of breaking apart the load forecast into different components using that bottom-up approach. So to answer your question on whether or not these were options or if this was done in the past, I would say this was done in the past based off my review of the 2022 load forecast.
Okay. And my next question is on slide 11. So when you move on to talk about differences, I guess I'm just trying to understand what you were saying, because it didn't come across clearly as to big forecasts, load growth. Are you talking about differences between what was done and what 1898 would have done?
Correct.
But I'm just trying to understand the message of this slide.
Yes, that is correct.
So when you say minimum load model not used by 1898 and co, it just means you don't use them, but they were used by CPS?
Yes, that is correct.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go to Peter. If anyone, I've lost your video, so I can't see who's wanting to speak. So just send a chat message to Ann, and she'll get to me. Peter, you're next.
Thank you, Reed. I want to thank Burns and McDonald for the interaction we had a couple of weeks ago. It was very beneficial. And one of the areas that you addressed on slide 12, the energy efficiency and demand response program savings seems conservative. And you referenced that you thought that other smaller utilities had done more than what you thought we would be achieving. And I know we're going to see this presentation from CRA as far as what the impact is, but can you provide more detail on how it could increase more of the capacity savings specifically? and also the revenue requirement that's going to be showing up. And because what I'm reading here is that the enhanced step sensitivity, and it was only on portfolio 4 that was run, that it would reduce the peak capacity requirements, thus fewer capacity additions are required to meet the peak demand and maintain the reserve margin. 2 RICE units are removed from P4 and a combustion of hydrogen, 8-hour storage and 20 hours of storage removed from P6. So that's what the current report is saying that the results would be from the current. And I just want to get more information on what exactly would be more of an energy efficiency effort.
Okay,
And I
Peter,
know it's just, it doesn't have to be answered in detail, but I just like to get more information on that.
good question. They've just told me they've said it's not showing enough here. I've just asked them to show us how much it should be, and I'm sure they'll have that for us on our next session, okay? All right, I don't see any more. I don't have any more going. Next section.
Can we have the slide up, please? So the next segment that I wanted to talk about was the existing resources. So existing resources, again, form a very important part of the total portfolio that the utility has, or in this case, CPS Energy. So there are various aspects of an existing resource that you can look at and across and so you can look at what we typically look at from can be done into 4 broad buckets. So we can look at it from an operations standpoint, unit retirements standpoint, cost assumptions, as well as capital investments. And I'll explain what are the different areas that what we looked at while we were reviewing the model data from CPS Energy. Next slide. Sorry. So for the key assumptions or the key inputs related to existing resources are basically, lined up along these bulleted points that we have here. The capacity of the resources is the capacity and the amount of generation it can generate. And then there are assumptions related to forced outage rates, which is basically of outages that can happen when the unit goes down unexpectedly. The non-fuel VOM or VOM here stands for variable operating cost. So that's one of the key inputs, because that the variable O&M cost along with the fuel cost is actually the cost or that the unit incurs when it is dispatched. And that is important because that cost of that of the unit is what determines when the unit will get selected to be dispatched based on its cost. So the other price is the PPA price. So for resources that are contracted through a power purchase agreement, we look at the PPA price, and for many of those, typically the renewable resources. And so those PPA for renewable resources won't have information regarding VO or non-fuel VOM or even the heat rates. It's basically the one in PPA or the power purchase agreement price. Then we look at assumptions regarding preventive maintenance, depending upon whether the unit is a owned resource or whether it's a PPA. So if it's an owned resource, preventive maintenance is important, because typically all the assets, all the regenerating resources that CPS Energy has needs to be taken offline sometime during the year to maintain it so that it can continue to operate as expected in the future. Well, then there are other dispatch parameters like how often can a unit be started, how long the unit must need to run to maintain its operating conditions, and how many and other parameters like that are important from a dispatch and from an operation standpoint. Those are the things that we need to look at within the key assumptions of units. Then the other thing is the expected capacity factors for wind and solar. So here, it is important here to understand what the expected capacity factors are for these type of resources, because these resources, this is important in terms of as you know, these are intermittent resources, and the energy from these resources are sort of must take it, must need to take it when it's available. And so the capacity factor and how the generation profile of these resources are important to look at in order to understand how these are modeled. Then we need to look at emission rates, especially emission rates related to CO2, because that is what is going to drive and you can see what the whole portfolio is generating on an annual basis. So this particular input, emission rates, is going to be important in that aspect. And then we need to understand what unit retirements are being considered, what sometimes units are going to be converted, as in this case, the Spruce unit is being converted to natural gas in some of the portfolios for the reference scenario. So all this is important to look at. And so what we did was to review the key input assumptions for the existing units. We actually asked a data dump from CRA for all the unit assumptions that they have, and we looked at the unit assumptions, and we looked at the and we backtracked it from the output side as well to see if the outputs are matching the inputs and how and if there were any discrepancies. We talked. There was one or two small discrepancies that we noticed while we were reviewing the data, and we since have talked with CPS Energy, and they have identified that issue, and they have working on rectifying that. But those are minor things, but in more in terms of accuracy. But I don't think that is going to change the overall outcome of the portfolios that have been established for the reference scenario. So in terms of that, all these assumptions or all these key inputs, they vary from technology to technology, right? So for a combined cycle unit, a heat rate, a typical heat rate of an F-class unit would be 7,000 BTUs per kilowatt hour, roughly in that range. While a CT, a combustion turbine, would be a frame combustion turbine would be roughly in the 10,000 BTU per kilowatt hour range. So these are some of the standard heat rates that we expect. And we used our knowledge of these technologies to review the data that was used for this for this particular study, and we found that from all the instances, these assumptions were reasonable and they were backed by data. Like for the forced outage rates for some of the older units, like the Broadwick unit, CPS used a previous study and that was done to understand what the forced outage rate should be, and based upon that, they have used a high rate. I think it was around 30% forced outage rate for some of the older CT units that was used, which I thought was reasonable given the age and the results from the study. So overall, from my review of the data, I think the existing unit assumptions that were used in the model, right? The same, we looked at the reference scenario, but the same assumptions as far as operating conditions are concerned would be used for the other scenarios as well. So overall, our understanding is that this was pretty robust, and it is as expected. The inputs match to what we would expect for technologies of size and age. Any questions on the existing resources?
Yeah, this question is not specifically about the resources, but it's a general theme that you probably will hear me say more and more of during this meeting. I liken what we're doing to something like a menu or a recipe. You have the ingredients and you have the procedure, right? You raise your temperature or preheat your oven to 350 as an example of the procedure. Now, when you list all those assumptions, those are things that I call inputs. They are your ingredients. And if you can speak more in subsequent, I guess, discussions, please speak more to the procedure as much as you can without going into too much maybe mathematical or probabilistic details, how those inputs were worked into this model or the modeling exercise. I think that would help us understand more about how the inputs were used in translating and how they were translated into what we now will be seeing as the results. You said earlier on that, inputs matching results matching inputs. Well, how? If we don't know the procedure, if we don't know the process,
Right.
then we may find it difficult to make the match that you understand the match that you're trying to describe. So
Sure, I think
that would be helpful.
yeah. So, well, one of the things that I was mentioning was, the non-fuel VOM, right? So the non-fuel VOM along with the fuel cost. So the fuel cost basically, the heat rate is basically what is used to calculate the fuel cost, right? So together with the heat rate and the fuel VOM, you will get what we call the dispatch cost of the unit, as well as other factors. But those are the two main factors for the dispatch of the unit, right? So when we're looking at what I looked at from, say, from the input side, we looked at whether the heat rates were reasonable, right? So I looked at, say, the combined cycle, which was around about 7,000 BTUs per kilowatt hour, right? And then when I'm looking at from a result standpoint, I went and looked at what was the total fuel consumption there and what was the total generation. So from the total generation, using the total generation and the total fuel consumption, dividing the total fuel by the total generation, I was able to back calculate what the actual heat rate the model was calculating, right? And that's what I looked back and referenced to the input. So that if they matched or they were close, that gives me a comfort that the model is working right, the inputs are matching the outputs, and that's what I was referring to as an example. So like that, same thing for force outage rate. So you can see from the output side what the force outage for they give you the force outage in megawatts for on a monthly basis, and you compare that with what the force outage rate was on the input basis, and if they match, then you're good that the results are looking as expected. So these are a couple of brief examples that I gave you, but if they want to have any specific examples that I want me to walk through, I can walk through that as well.
On the expected capacity factor for wind and solar, you have different outputs or different capacities in summer versus winter. Did you use the better of the two or the worst case of the two?
What I saw was that, so the way the modeling works is basically you have, there are 8760 hours in a year, right? So for solar and wind, we typically have a 8760 profile. That means it gives you based on, as far as the existing resources are concerned, based on previous history, as well as we look at the hourly generation throughout the entire year and use that as a guide to put input into the model, right? And so it is not just a capacity factor in terms of percentage, but basically the expected generation every hour for that project throughout that year. And what I looked at was that they have used different profiles at different generation, different capacity factors for different projects. Oftentimes we see, as a quick way to do the modeling sometimes, or to simplify assumptions, the same profile is used for different projects which are located geographically dispersed. But here we looked at some of the data and we saw that the capacity factors that were utilized were different for the different projects. And so it's not, the same pattern that is used for each of the projects. It's similar, but it has still its nuances and variances for each project.
So in worst case scenarios, because you flattened it out for the year, for worst case scenarios, we can expect to go to market
Yeah,
rate.
this is, at this point, we're not doing any variation analysis on the generation profile. It is a deterministic model at this time, right? So we input one model shape, right? And that's being utilized for the project going forward every year.
And this is an industry standard in doing this?
Yes, it is an industry standard in doing this because it's doing, and you're right. I mean, there is not, I would say, a standard approach of doing any stochastic around the solar profile or wind profile generation, because it's linked to a lot of factors like that would happen in the future, whether, and other things, of course, taken into account. But in terms of long-term planning, on the base case reference portfolio, yes, this is a standard approach of doing it in a deterministic manner.
Thank you.
So next, I will talk about the ERCOT market design. So why is it important? Because it is important here because CPS Energy is part of ERCOT, and CPS Energy is not an electrical island. It does not operate by itself. Has reliance on the ERCOT market as far on a daily basis. So it's important to understand how the ERCOT market design works. Or how the ERCOT market has been designed in the model and the model topology to make sure to better understand and make sure that the assumptions related to that are reasonable and practical. So like what I explained for the key assumptions related to the existing resources, there are various things that we look at from in terms of when you're looking at the market modeling inputs. So here are some of the key assumptions or the key points that we looked at. So we looked at how the ERCOT market was configured, whether it was done on a nodal basis or a zonal basis. In this case, it was done on a zonal basis with 4 different zones as ERCOT, 4 different zones in ERCOT with zonal transmission limits between the zones. We looked at the load assumptions, and we looked at the different unit retirements and how the information related to those unit retirements. And at the time the study was done, we look the CRA has a market report that they have prepared for CPS Energy. We reviewed that report, and based on those, on the commentary provided in the report and some of the questions that we asked of CRA about the market design, we were comfortable about the information that they put in about unit retirements, about the ERCOT interconnection queue, and the general, the generic technology assumptions. So one of the key things that we also talked about, and that is important in the future, is the effective load carrying capacity, or ELCC, or the capacity value for intermittent resources like wind and solar, especially in case of ERCOT, it is more for solar. This, it is important because there is there is a reason why this is so, because we accept solar energy or intermittent energy is basically sort of a must-take energy, right? So whenever energy is available from solar, you take it, and then you adjust the load demand to become the load to become the net load, and then you dispatch your other resources against the net load. Now, as over time, as more and more solar resources get added into the portfolio in ERCOT, what would happen is that there would be more and more solar generation, and in doing so, the net load curve will be depressed down. And so what we see is a sort of a duck curve effect, is that the actual demand or the actual peak demand for the day starts to shift. So previously, if it was around 4 o'clock, over time, as you add more and more solar generation, the peak will now not happen at 4 o'clock, because in 4 o'clock you have a lot of solar generation, but it will, the shift, and will probably happen around 6 or 7 o'clock. And by that time, the solar generation during that particular hour goes down than it was at 4 o'clock. So what would happen is that the firm capacity, or the ELCC, or the capacity value of that intermittent resource, is going to decline over time, right? And so why is that important? Now, as the value of solar, capacity value of solar declines over time, you would need to add more resource from a capacity standpoint to maintain your reserve margin, because the capacity value for that particular resource has, for that technology of resources is going down. And as you add more resources to that, so there will be more abundant energy to serve, and that impacts the overall market dynamics, the energy prices, and a host of other things in the market. So we looked at the ELCC assumptions, and especially since going into the future, it is in the ERCOT queue, there is so much of solar and resources that will be added. So it's important to consider that factor while we are looking at the assumptions for the new technologies and the new resources that will come online in the future. And what we have seen is that based upon their analysis, right now, ERCOT in their recent CDR report predicts an 80% capacity value for solar. But over the next 25 years, over a gradually, that capacity value of solar will decline. And so what CRAS has assumed in their model is that it declines to roughly about 12% over the period of the next 25 years. I think the analysis that they have done is okay, and based on our expectation, the value looks aggressive. The decline of the capacity value looks is possible, but it's a bit aggressive than what we would expect. We typically would have expected the capacity value to decline to about 20 to 25%. But based on their analysis, they've declined it to 12%, which is not completely impossible, but as I said, it's more aggressive for that. We looked at the overall reserve margin levels that they've maintained, and we have looked at the expected capacity factors of wind and solar for the new generation, and also the emission rates for various units out there. So in reviewing the data, as I said, I think the data looked very reasonable, and the approach that they have taken to market modeling also looked reasonable from a zonal standpoint. And the energy prices that they have come out, I think it starts off in the $40 per megawatt hour range. All the round the clock prices seems reasonable going out for the next 25 years. Any questions on the market, ERCOT market modeling? Yes, Dr.
Again, another methodology question.
Yes.
You talk about this ELCC, and I think it's a very, very important factor because it could make or break, or it could be a game changer regarding the ultimate generation portfolio. Is there an industry standard curve or something? Because you have an expectation that you said, oh, you're expecting something like 80%. What's the basis for those expectations? Are there any standards that you're sort of basing your expectation on, like what you have seen from CPS and CRA?
The 80% number comes from ERCOT. It's from the CDR report, that the recent CDR report that ERCOT has published. Okay. Now, in terms of an industry standard, no. I think as an industry, this is a big challenge going for us. And ELCC, we cannot say that, okay, solar, this is going to be the ELCC value of solar across for all utilities across all of the US. It depends upon a lot of parameters, including, the resource mix, how, shared generation, shared resources, load profile, all that thing comes into place. So in terms of establishing ELCC, there is no industry standard as yet, and that's what one of the questions we were answering the other day was that the industry is, we are struggling to find a correct approach to doing that, and how and what capacity value can be given to this to these intermittent resources.
Okay, we have a question from Michael Kinnick. He's online. So Michael, please go.
Yeah, this is Michael Kinnick. I guess I need a little bit of a clarification of the discussion on expected capacity factor of this solar. What I thought I heard you say was that at the end of this period of time, 25 years, that the solar capacity would end up at 25%, meaning a 75% reduction? Or did you mean a 25% reduction so the capacity down the road would be 75% of what was originally there? That just wasn't clear to me what you were saying. Over.
Understood, Michael. Let me explain. So, capacity factor and what we are talking about, ELCC and capacity value, though both are measured in terms of percent, are completely different concepts. So capacity factor basically tells you how much it gives you a reference, right? So if a 100 megawatt plant is operating throughout the year, every hour at its full capacity, then the capacity factor would have been 100%. But for wind and solar, for intermittent resources, because they're related to natural resources, which is not available all the time, it is not possible to have 100% capacity factor for these resources. So these resources can only generate at a certain period during the day and for certain hours during the entire year. So the capacity factor that we are talking about is actually trying to measure how many, layman's language or in easy language, it is trying to measure how many hours that the unit can generate during the whole year. What the capacity value or what the ELCC value is telling us is what is the capacity value or what is the contribution that resource can make during the peak hour during the year. Okay, so that your peak happens during one particular hour throughout the entire year. And the ELCC is trying to measure how much generation the resource can do or allocate towards that peak demand at that peak hour, that particular hour during the year.
Let me try to ask a question, Michael, if I can, to get this up to a little higher level. Are you saying that the Charles River Associates analysis overvalues the capacity of wind and solar? Are you saying it undervalues the capacity of wind and solar?
What I'm saying is,
It's over or under? Which one are you saying?
It starts off with what we expect.
Which
is 80%.
Well, but that doesn't mean okay, go ahead.
But over time, as the value is decreasing, the capacity value is going down to 12%.
How much?
12, 1, 2. So, yeah, what I say that is aggressive is that it is undervaluing the capacity of solar to a certain extent.
Okay, thank you. That's what I was trying to get to. Michael, back to you. Michael,
I'm sorry. Along those lines, though, is there also a deterioration of the capability of solar panels over time, and was that taken into account? Because I understand a new panel is going to be a certain percent efficient, and then that efficiency goes down over time. Was that taken into account in this study?
That's a very good question, Michael. I appreciate that question, but I think, and I may be wrong, I need to review the data further, but I think the capacity factor for solar projects over time has been remains constant. That's the assumption for the long-term study.
Okay, anybody else online there? Okay, I have one quick overall question. If you remember, and I could be corrected by CRA, but I think in their assumptions, they put the reference case as ERCOT's generation planning as and generation schema as continuing as it is, which is an energy-only market. I could be corrected, and if I am, please do that. Do you see ERCOT staying as an energy-only market or moving more to a capacity market whatever they call it.
So at this point, I think in terms of the reference scenario, I think the definition of keeping a car as a energy only market is reasonable, because we don't know for sure. There is possibility that this will change. So I think they are addressing that change towards a capacity market in one of the scenarios. But for the reference scenario, as a ERCOT continuing to be energy or market, energy only market is a reasonable assumption.
Okay, now we have a question from Michael Sanchez.
Thank you. What I'm trying to figure out is, on these scenarios, did these scenarios take into account for the sustainability portion, the storage disposal cost factors, say for the batteries, they wear out at a certain time, and it's going to cost some sort of cost there to get rid of them and bring in new ones. Over.
I need to get back to you on that, but I think from most of the storage assumptions, and John from CPS Energy, correct me if I'm wrong, are related to the assumptions are that it would be a PPA agreement and not a ownership plan, and so any disposable cost would be back onto the PPA, the developer. Is that correct?
Yeah, this is Pat Augustine. That's correct that we would assume a PPA, but I will note that for augmentation and replacing battery cells and keeping the capacity rating over time, that cost is assumed to be embedded in that PPA price. So it's a PPA, but the costs I think you're referring to are included.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Let's, I see no more. Let's move. Oh, it's 4:30.
Back to the.
Okay, I'm gonna see, how much longer do y'all have on yours?
We have about 5-6 slides more to go.
5 or 6 to go? Okay, let's finish this and then we'll take a break, okay?
Okay, so John Christensen, are you online?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, John, go ahead.
All right. Thanks for having me. Work with Debashis and our resource planning market assessments team. Coming to you here virtually from Duluth, Minnesota. Just going to talk briefly about some of the new technology assumptions. So these are, excuse me, assumptions pertaining to new resources that are added to the portfolios and what's driving the costs or PPA costs, depending on the resource technology type for the assessment here. So Debashis, if you're in control, if you could advance to the next slide here, we'll talk renewables and storage first. Generally speaking, with this type of modeling, when you're looking at new resources, there's a few pieces. One, you need to know how much it's going to cost to build that resource in whatever year you're going to build it. And then you're going to need to know the technology-specific modeling assumptions or its operating parameters, similar to what Debashis talked through a couple slides ago with the existing resources. So what's it going to cost to operate and maintain it? What is the parameters of its capabilities? You know, how fast can it dispatch or absorb energy, things like that. So took a look at the assumptions brought in on the modeling here for the different scenarios. And just starting with wind, solar, primarily, those resources are fairly easy to model, so to speak, from a technology modeling parameters perspective. They're pretty well known what that takes. The cost curves for those have been a little challenging to predict as of late. And so, you know, we've all been, you know, looking to what's going on with solar tariffs and other things. What was done for this particular study was to take a look at publicly available forward pricing curves from reputable sources, and those are available in the public domain with long-term real price declines associated with those technologies. And Charles Rivers and Associates combined those cost curves that are projections, but reasonable nonetheless, with publicly available data on current costs. And so what we see when we look to the future with those two technologies specifically is that we have a range of low, medium, and high forecasts, but they do reflect kind of the current market realities with expectations of price changes over time. So we find that those are pretty reasonable. Our approach in IRPs is very similar to Charles Rivers Associates, and so we don't disagree at all with those. Storage is very similar. Storage has some unknowns as well on the price curves going forward, but there are publicly available sources that seek to predict those. Those were used again, and the technology-specific modeling parameters for storage quite reasonable as well. Geothermal is a little bit of a different beast in terms of its maturity and its availability right now. It's a little bit harder to predict some of the key parameters. The sources pulled for geothermal were kind of the best that is available publicly at this point, and we're not really aware of a lot of other information out there from private sources that would be more accurate than anything in the public domain. So overall, in the new technologies for renewables and short-term storage, we find that the approach and the forecast for overnight capital costs and the technology-specific modeling parameters seems pretty reasonable to us. We'll note that for the cases that, for the resources that have high, medium, and low cost forecasts, the base or the middle price curve is being used in the reference scenario. Seems pretty reasonable for that particular scenario. And then some of the other three scenarios, one uses high, one uses low, and another one uses the base forecast. So again, that seems pretty reasonable to us. Debashis, can you jump to the next slide there for me? All right, I'm going to talk really quickly about thermal related assets here. Traditional gas, which is going to encompass your traditional combined cycles, combustion turbines, aeroderivatives, internal combustion engines. Again, pulled from public sources, the modeling specific parameters seem quite reasonable. Nothing seemed out of whack there. Again, they're projected to decline in real dollars over the study period, which is appropriate, I think, for these types of resources. Moving to hydrogen, the study considers hydrogen combustion turbines, which is effectively similar to a current combustion turbine, but fired on hydrogen gas instead of natural gas. A lot of assumptions related to hydrogen CTs or even CCs remain somewhat difficult to pin down at this point, given the fact that OEMs, equipment manufacturers, are still trying to do designs for some of these types of units. The approach that Charles Rivers and Associates took here to come up with some prices is based on current CT prices, which as a base is pretty reasonable given that the majority of that technology will be recycled for hydrogen CTs. We did add a little bit of additional cost to cover the uncertainties of the new technology and also some likely additional technology or additional infrastructure required to handle hydrogen on site. So again, these seem pretty reasonable. The technology is really not available until at least 2030, which is also a pretty likely assumption, just given what we're hearing from the GEs, the Siemens, Mitsubishis of the world who are trying to build these. SMR, again, also technology that is in development and is moving towards licensing, but is not there yet. So very similar. Excuse me. Using some publicly available data, we're expecting that these resources aren't going to be available until 2030 or beyond, but it does seem like is probably reasonable for what SMR is looking like today. Hard to predict late into the future, late into the study period, but what we're hearing near term for the 2030s, these assumptions seem pretty in line with industry information. So I will pause there if there are any questions. Otherwise, I'll turn it back to Debashis.
Thanks, John. 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. My name is Brian Despard, and I'm also a project manager, and I'm helping DeBashis with an evaluation of commodity prices, as well as an evaluation of the scenario risk components. I'll talk first about the commodity prices. So we focused on coal, natural gas, uranium, and the CO2 costs. What we've done is examine CPS's approach. And what I'm trying to portray here is at a high level kind of the result of the approach and our preliminary assessment of their approach and the results. So coal first, the approach to coal was pretty straightforward. Transportation was factored in, existing agreements, and forward pricing was used beyond that or for any of the market purchases. And they relied on a reputable third party for their price forecasts. For both coal and natural gas, there's probably half a dozen very reputable sources for forecasts. And one of those sources has been used for both coal and natural gas. So the approach results in prices that are very flat in real terms. We definitely agree with that. Coal is more and more becoming cost-based with decreased demand. So that makes sense. And again, flat coal prices due primarily to decreasing demand. Natural gas prices, the buildup is as we would expect. There's a primary hub price, which is very irrelevant for CPS in this market, which is Henry Hub. There's basis price forecasts that are included as well. Transportation costs are forecasted, and the hedge and fixed portion of the transportation costs are forecasted, and then included after the production cost modeling run. The result is for natural gas pricing, the current high prices, or I should say that the forecasts that are being utilized incorporate forward indications out through, I can't remember the time period, it may be 12 to 18 months. And then those forward indications get blended in with a modeled forecast. So the current high prices are reflected in the forecast. And the expectation is those are going to come off and that there's going to be about 1.8% price year-over-year change through time. Again, the source is reputable. I'll talk a little bit more about natural gas on the next slide. We have a note here. We're currently evaluating the basis transport and hedge costs. We've kind of been into that. The hedge cost straightforward, so no issues there. Basis so far is straightforward, and so is the transport. So we're going to maybe look at that a little bit more, but that's all looking pretty good. Uranium is kind of similar across all the forecasts we typically see. And the internal CPS forecast is consistent with public sources we see. We tend to rely on NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. So the uranium forecasts, which are flat in real terms over time, is fairly consistent with what we see from other indicators, under other indications. Carbon dioxide, this is challenging, I think, for all folks that are doing resource plans just because of the transition we have now into tax incentives, especially with the IRA. That being said, the forecast is being maintained from what was used the previous year. And the forecast starts in 2027 is very modest at $5 a ton, doubles by 2028, and then rises up to $51 by 2046. That is probably reasonable. It's, again, it's difficult. There's not only do you have cap, but if you have a carbon tax and then you have tax subsidies on top of that, they all are kind of doing the same thing. And they all will perhaps have offsetting effects. So we're going to look at the results a little bit more to see if there's, perhaps something that looks odd to us going on. But our expectation is that the CO2 prices, to a large extent, are going to be not offset, but the impact will be the same as the other drivers as well. Probably the cap driver would be the bigger driver here. Okay, getting into the scenarios just very quickly. Here's a slide you've seen before. We worked off of this slide from CRA, the inputs across the top, commodity prices, carbon policy, technology cost, demand, and the ERCOT market. And these, of course, are going across the 4 scenarios that I'm sure everybody's familiar with. The relationship or the assessment of the impact, we agree with everything that Charles Rivers has here. I think we want to get a little bit more information about for the carbon-based economy, the low commodity prices, and also for the net zero carbon economy, the fast decline of technology costs. So those are 2 items that are a little bit outstanding. Something that's very important, we were talking about electrification and the demand forecast. It's very important to have that in there under the net zero carbon economy. So this, for the most part, except for a couple of things we want to understand better, this all makes a lot of sense to us. So the components, the commodity prices and demand and technology costs used in the various scenarios. For the coal and natural gas, CRA and CPS use EIA forecasts to develop the relationship back to the reference case. That is common. There's different approaches that can be taken, including stochastic approaches. But certainly EIA differentials are used in the industry and accepted. The remaining items, apologies for the comments there, those are the CO2 costs, demand, technology costs. We're still reviewing all that, so I won't comment on that right now. So looking at the gas, this is something worth digging into. It's very important. Gas, in our opinion, is one of the biggest drivers in scenario analysis. So what we have here are the EIA scenarios along with the corresponding or the assigned CPS scenario and the gas price, Henry Hub gas price in real and nominal terms. The first line is a reference case, and this is all for year 2047. So it's the last year we have of the prices in the price curve. First line is a reference case, and you can see the 3 scenarios, 3 other scenarios: carbon-based economy, net zero economy, and volatile market. The important thing here is that the lowest and highest price from EIA's forecast were captured. So we certainly agree with that. We think that's very important. Something I will point out is that while the real price is kind of in the ballpark, maybe a little bit low compared to EIA, which doesn't necessarily make it right or wrong, but the inflation, overall inflation, is lower in CPS's assumptions than the EIA. We have seen forecasts lower than this, and we've seen forecasts higher than EIA's forecasts. Right now, there's a lot of disparity in gas pricing due to inflation and also due to future impacts from tax incentives on renewables and things like that. So let me pause here and see if there's any questions.
Okay, we're getting ready for our break, but I think we've got a quick question from Dana, if we can get that, and then we'll go get your cookie.
Well, I was just curious to know how you could input ERCOT changes into the model when they're not yet known.
Well, they're not. That's kind of what they said.
But I didn't understand the slide then because it said
Yeah, no,
ERCOT changes input.
no, they're, what I'm understanding from Charles River and again from Burns and Mac is they're just kind of business as usual, staying the way it is. If that's wrong, somebody correct me. Not seeing any heads go in any direction, so
That means no changes from ERCOT?
it's saying that they're going to stay with the way they are, and they're only going to put assumptions or changes in here that are known at this time. So I think is that the way I read your work? If not, you talk about it. I'm not the one to talk about it.
No, that's accurate, but 1 out of the 4 scenarios, we do have a formal capacity market simulated. Otherwise, current energy only construct.
Right. And that's the 1-0 deal. Okay. Does that get your question, Dana?
Yeah, but it doesn't seem reasonable, since ERCOT has said they're going to do something, they just don't know what it is.
That's right, but the consultants are saying they're not going to guess, I guess.
That's right.
Well, yeah, I think you need to
Dana,
make some assumptions. You can't just say it's going to stay like it is when it's not.
Well, Dana, we got a speaker here, so let's let him talk.
Hey, Dana, it's John Cossop. On the Q&A from last meeting, it's a version October 17th, item number 13. Maybe we can pull that up, or if you have it available, take a look at that. We explain potential futures changes to the ERCOT market design and things like that, and the regulatory process and how long it would take and things like that. So take a look at that. That might help kind of fill in more information for you.
Okay, thanks. I mean, I didn't see that anywhere. If somebody could just send it over to me or post it on the screen, I'd appreciate it.
I think is that in part of the questions that came out today?
Not today. It was
that
from
was the one before.
Previous meeting.
Okay, it's in the distribution, Dana. You haven't been able to be here. We need to get the hard copies over to you, and I'll try to bring those to you, but it's in that hard copy. That's why you haven't seen it.
Appreciate it, Reed. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, go. Cookie time. Okay, we've got a lot to do here in this next section. So let's get started. Everybody back?
Yes.
Okay. Looks like you're queued up. All right, go.
All right. Thank you, Reed, and good afternoon, everyone. And I'll just say thanks to Burns and Mac for queuing up the review of the reference case. And as Debash just mentioned, we'll be continuing to share additional material for all the other scenarios and sensitivities that we'll be walking through today. So hopefully there'll be some more follow-up on that. So today's focus, recap the initial reference case results that we presented back in the October meeting. And then we're also going to review a full suite of results for the market scenarios, all the sensitivities, and all the implications for all that analysis on the scorecard. So this is a big data reveal. Lots of information is out there. Understand there will be a lot of follow-up questions. But today's objectives are really to get the information out there. No decisions are being made, and allow for the group to ask questions and get comments.
Excuse me just a minute. Let me make one comment. Since we've got so much to go through and we've got so little time, we're going to ask that we just go right on through this, because we're going to have a question and answer period for two 2-hour periods, and just on the second. So let's get through it, and then if we want to, we can stay over later and answer questions, but let's get all the way through it so that we don't hold people here past 6 o'clock. Okay?
Okay, thank you. So for the agenda today, we're going to do a real quick recap of interactions since the October 20th meeting, recap of where we are in the progress, provide a review of the portfolios and the scorecard, and then we're going to give a rundown of the scenarios and sensitivities. Some of that will be a review, some of it will be new, and then the meat of the presentation here is really a summary of the portfolio performance and results against all of the scenarios, all of the sensitivities, and we'll wrap up with an integrated summary of the scorecard. So all the results will be populated through, and there'll be some final comments on timeline and next steps. So since the October 20th meeting, CPS Energy has compiled a set of questions and comments that were raised during that meeting, that were raised during the Burns and Mac Q&A session on November 3rd, and that were raised via email or other interactions with RAC members. So we'll not spend any time on those responses, but just want to alert the group to the fact that a packet Q&A number 2 was provided that has about 25 to 30 questions and answers in written form in response to all that interaction. In terms of the process, this is the diagram that we've been using since July now. This is the 5-step process, and we're nearing the end. We're really focused on step 4, market portfolio modeling and analysis. Just to recap again and set the stage, you'll recall in July and August, we spent a lot of time talking about objectives and metrics, and those have since been refined over the last few months. July through September, we spent a lot of time talking about market scenarios, those external conditions, what they look like, how to parameterize them. And then between August and last meeting in October, we provided quite a lot of detail on the resource portfolios, the CPS Energy strategies that were developed, how they were developed, and what the outcomes for those portfolio strategies were in terms of retirement dates for the existing fleet and new resources coming into the mix. So October's meeting spent a lot of time on that. We presented the reference case analysis in October, and now we're moving into that phase of results sharing for all of the portfolio and scenario and sensitivity permutations. So before we get into the meat of the results, wanted to do a little bit more stage setting and recapping of where we were in October, what the portfolios look like, provide you a little bit of an update on some tweaks that have been made to the scorecard, and then start to get into the details. So this slide is one that you have in your handouts that is kind of a standalone cheat sheet. It's just a reminder of the 9 portfolios that we're studying. There's additional detail that shows the year-by-year retirement dates, the year-by-year new resource additions that you've got in appendix material. But just for reference, we've got the 4 portfolios on the left-hand column that were primarily offered by CPS Energy. Highlights on the allowed technologies, highlights on the action for the existing fleet, key retirement dates and key notes on when coal and gas units are coming in and out of the portfolio, and then a pie chart that shows the generation mix under reference case conditions in 2030. This is the generation mix. There's different views that we went over in October on the capacity and supply-demand balance. And what we'll talk about a little bit more today is how that generation mix can vary across scenarios. But this is just a useful snapshot to give a comparative view of each of the 9 portfolios. In terms of the scorecard, a few minor updates have been made since October, largely in response to comments from RAC members and others, and then a few other tweaks that we think will help the presentation of ultimate results. So I'll go through those very quickly here. First of all, emission intensity. You might recall in October, we presented the emission intensity just for the CPS Energy fleet or resources that make up the portfolio. There was some feedback and consultation with the environmental teams around including market purchases as well in that emission intensity, and we have made that addition. So everything that you'll see today includes not only emissions associated with resources that CPS either owns or contracts with, but also to the extent there are small levels of market purchases from ERCOT, those are going to be embedded into the calculation. So small change, it's not impacting the relative ordering of portfolios, but that has been updated. Secondly, on the environmental sustainability objective, we have the percentage reduction in consumption due to energy efficiency. You'll recall that was held constant across all the portfolios in the reference case. We're going to show you some step sensitivities today. But that number in the reference case has been changed slightly to include all elements of the STEP program. So not just energy efficiency, but also demand response and rooftop solar. So all that's rolled into the accounting now. So again, a minor change, but wanted to point that out. On the affordability metrics, we've made some slight changes to how those are going to be presented. Everything in the scorecard that you will see going forward is going to be presented in a revenue requirement and a $1 per megawatt hour generation cost summary. So there have been talk in the past about presenting bill impacts on the scorecard. The RAC members have received a big packet, and we're going to talk a little bit about bill impacts today, but from a scorecard perspective, rather than a single year's bill impact, which is somewhat of an arbitrary point in time, we've made the decision here to try to summarize the costs for the next 7 years or so. So the average cost per megawatt hour of the generation fleet effectively is what's going into that number. It's a pretty standard practice within the industry. We hope it'll be a little bit simpler to understand from a scorecard perspective, but that doesn't take away from all the other backup data that members here are being supplied with, whether it's annual revenue requirements, annual bill impacts, or other ways of looking at the data. So that's all still available, but you'll see the scorecard labeling is just slightly different. And then finally, CPS Energy workforce impact. Back in October, what we previously reported was the remaining total size of CPS Energy's generation workforce, or at least an estimate for that. We're just flipping that around here now to present best estimate of the number of employees that could be impacted. So hopefully that's a little bit more intuitive. Again, the relationship between different portfolios is constant, but it's a slight change in the reporting mechanism. So this scorecard, we're going to get to the fully populated version in a few minutes here once we get through all the analysis summaries. But this is just a reminder of what has just changed effectively if you're trying to map back to your October version and what we're going to show today. So everything highlighted in red are metrics that have had small tweaks, whether it's adding market purchases to the emissions, updating the STEP impacts, updating the way we report workforce numbers, as well as the labels up on the affordability. And then we're going to get into the details on the extreme weather and the affordability metrics as we walk through the presentation. So everything else, the shading and the relative positioning is pretty much the same as what we left you with in October, but wanted to just preview that and let you know some of those adjustments that I've made before we get into the details. So let's move into those details and start with a recap of the scenario concepts and how those are different from portfolios, and then walk through the key inputs that go into each of the scenarios and into each of the sensitivities that we're evaluating. So what we're going to start with is a recap of key inputs, key structure of the scenarios and sensitivities, how they were formed, how we built them out. And then after we do that stage setting, we'll move into how that translates to the CPS Energy portfolios. So just as a reminder, this is a slide deck that we have, or a slide that we have used in prior decks several times. And the idea here is just to distinguish between what's a scenario, what's a portfolio. The portfolios are the CPS Energy paths or strategies. They incorporate supply side, demand side actions on existing resources, new resources coming into the portfolio. And that's what we just showed a couple slides ago on those 9 concepts that we've built out. Scenarios are more external future states of the world that are somewhat external to what CPS Energy can control. So they include the things that we were just talking about earlier, fuel prices, carbon policy, demand growth, technology costs, et cetera. And that's what we're going to focus now on recapping. So this slide is a new one that we've put together kind of as a cheat sheet. I believe in your supplemental pack of slides, it's one of those that you might want to refer back and forth to, and we'll come again to it as we step through these different slides. But it's one way of just visualizing the different scenarios and sensitivities that we're evaluating. There's 8 total areas of uncertainty that we're looking at. The first 4 are scenario-based. The next 4 are what we call sensitivity-based. And we'll walk into or walk through the details of each of these in a few minutes here, but this is an overview. I'm not going to walk through each cell on this slide, but the idea here is that the first 4 lines, including the gray reference shaded on the top, are those scenarios that we've been talking about. They are fundamental states of the world that we've built out full 25-year forecasts for each of the key elements, and we evaluate each of the 9 portfolios against those scenarios. They have different ERCOT prices, different gas prices, different carbon prices, different technology costs, different CPS Energy demand, and they're intended to be correlated and integrated states of the world moving forward. And like I said, we evaluate all years, all portfolios. The extreme weather case is more of a sensitivity. This is one way of looking at a tail event that could happen in any given year, and as a result, we're sampling 1 year. So you'll see in that 3rd column, we're just looking at the year 2030 in this sensitivity. It's not assuming extreme weather happens every year for the next 25 years, but what if it happens in any given year? We'll sample 2030. And as you can see, that stress tests ERCOT prices, gas prices, CPS Energy demand, and resource availability. We'll get into those assumptions in a few minutes here. And then the last 3 on the list, enhanced step, reduced step, and this build versus buy concept, those are one-off sensitivities that we do on a sample of portfolios to try to get a sense directionally of the value of additional step or reduced step, or the cost and other implications of PPAing or purchasing resources as opposed to building and owning them yourselves. So again, you can see some of the highlights there, but columns 2 and 3 I think are useful just to ground you on which portfolio concepts we're evaluating and over which time period. So quick recap on the market scenarios. We just saw this in the Burns and Mack review as well. But as a reminder, we have these 4 scenarios. We spent a lot of time in the reference case in October, but the 3 alternative scenarios develop different states of the world for each of these key drivers. Won't go box by box, but from a high level, I think the key points to keep in mind are the carbon-based economy scenario, low gas prices, no carbon price. So a low market price environment with no carbon regulation and cheap gas prices. Net zero economy scenario, somewhat the opposite, but has some other implications. This has high carbon price, high load, and renewables are cheaper than we expect in the reference case. So carbon price penalizes fossil resources, renewables are cheaper. And then the volatile market scenario, I think the simplest way to think about that is high gas prices and high renewable costs. A situation that might be reflective of recent months where we've seen inflation, supply chain pressures, putting upward pressure on the price of natural gas and other commodities, and limiting some of the reductions historically that we have been seeing in renewable markets or renewable technology costs. So those are the themes. We're going to walk through the details of how they shaped out on the portfolios in a few minutes. Next couple of slides go a little bit deeper into those sensitivities. We've talked about these sensitivities at a higher level in past meetings, but today we want to spend a little bit more time defining exactly what are in these sensitivities and ultimately how they shake out from an analysis perspective. So just as a reminder, as I said a minute ago, the sensitivities are separate in many ways from scenarios. Scenarios are integrated storylines of future states of the world. The sensitivities are somewhat one-off events that can be shocks to the system or specific elements that we want to test. The extreme weather sensitivity, as I mentioned, is something that we're looking at for one sample year. And the idea here is to simulate the impacts if we were to have a winter event similar to Storm Uri and a summer event similar to the heat wave of about 10 years ago, where you had very hot temperatures for an extended period of time throughout the months of July and August. So in order to develop these sensitivities, we've varied each of the elements here in the columns on this table in both the winter and the summer season. So we've used actual historical data to try to proxy these weather events. For the winter, we're focused on a 10-day period from February 2021 that we extrapolate forward into February of 2030 for model simulation purposes. We use spot prices that were observed for natural gas in Texas during that Storm Uri period. We use actual wind outage data from that Storm Uri period that has been reported quite significantly in ERCOT's analysis of the event, adjusted for some of the weatherization and equipment improvement impacts that we are seeing in the market come out of Senate Bill 3. We use actual solar data, so actual solar irradiation and solar capacity factor data that comes from that extreme event. So I think actually in response to Al's question earlier, although in the reference case or the other cases we have an expected smooth or at least representative solar shape, we're stress testing that here. In this type of winter event, we saw much lower solar output, and that's what's simulated based on those actual performance data. Gas outages, similar to wind here. We're looking at actual outage data, but adjusted for the winterization and other improvements that we're seeing, not only CPS Energy, but other participants in the market take action on in response to Senate Bill 3. So we have actual outages reduced for some of the weatherization programs. Just from a modeling perspective, we're not simulating full plants going down, but we're simulating a percentage of CPS Energy's gas fleet being unavailable as a result of these conditions. And then finally, demand, the consumption or the demand for electricity based again on the demand pattern during Winter Storm Uri. So CPS Energy's load forecasting group has taken that data and extrapolated it forward into a 2030 forecast year. The summer event's a little bit simpler because we're not assuming that there are plant outages that occur from a heat wave, and it's really all about the demand. So for the 2 months in the summer, we're simulating much higher demand, again, based on that 2011 Texas summer heat wave data extrapolated forward to 2030. So that's the overview. These are the key variables that go into that sensitivity. And again, as a reminder, it's just for the year 2030 for modeling purposes. The next sensitivity or the next two sensitivities deal with the STEP program. So these sensitivities test the impact of different levels of energy efficiency programs on portfolio costs. So as I mentioned before, we're sampling just a couple portfolios. And what we're looking at is if the STEP program was enhanced or reduced or pulled back, what would the demand growth, both energy throughout the year and peak demand, look like? The graphics on the left-hand side show in orange the reduced STEP impact higher load, higher megawatt hours of demand, higher peak demand on the bottom. And on the flip side, if you enhance the STEP program, there would be lower load, fewer megawatt hours to serve, fewer megawatts at peak. So you can see it really ramps up in the latter part of the decade and grows throughout the 2030s. From a modeling perspective, what we do is effectively adjust the load by that amount and then rerun the simulation. One point here is that we're applying the enhanced STEP and the reduced STEP sensitivities just to portfolios 4 and 6. The idea here is rather than run all 9 portfolios through each of these simulations over a 25-year period, let's pick some bookends, see what we learn from that. Portfolio 4 is one that does the least turnover to the fleet. So it retains the spruce units. It adds a mix of some renewables, but also gas capacity. Whereas portfolio 6 has the largest turnover of the existing fleet and doesn't add any new gas capacity, completely focused on renewables and storage to meet energy and capacity needs. So the idea there is to try to get a sense of what the cost impacts would be under 2 bookend type portfolios and how the change in energy and capacity needs would impact portfolio costs. Of course, there is a cost associated with the STEP program, so those costs associated with these changes in load are also embedded into the analysis. And then final sensitivity is the build versus buy sensitivity. There are different ways that this could be looked at, but what we've done in the analysis thus far is really look at what would happen if CPS Energy shifted away from ownership to all PPAs for all new resource types. And as we mentioned, I think in the last meeting, the reference scenario assumption is that CPS Energy would own new natural gas, new hydrogen, new geothermal capacity additions, and PPA wind, solar, and storage. In this build versus buy sensitivity, we push everything into a PPA. So assume private ownership of those resources. Generally, developers have higher cost of capital than a municipal entity like CPS Energy. And we build up a PPA price for what that looks like. It's going to have a cost impact on the portfolio, but also has some impact on local workforce, local economic investment, and that's the idea to try to look at those trade-offs. Okay, so that's a quick rundown of each of the inputs that go into all the scenarios, the sensitivities. The next section here is going to step through some of the results for the portfolios. There's a lot of data, as I'm sure you're starting to appreciate, and we've tried to pull out some of the key highlights. So as we step through the next few slides, we're going to try to give you some grounding in what's happening in the portfolio, what's happening in terms of generation mix of the different resources, the emission intensities, and ultimately the market purchases and costs that go into the portfolios. There's different ways of looking at this information, of course. There's annual data, there's monthly data, there's even more granular data. There's sample years that we could look at. So what we're trying to do is give a flavor for how the different portfolios, 1 to 9, are going to perform under each of the 4 scenarios for some key metrics, ultimately building up to the scorecard. So as was referenced before, there'll be time for additional Q&A, and especially on the financial results, there's a lot of detail behind it. But the next few slides are going to try to step through each of these scenarios and see the trade-offs from different angles, and then ultimately land on the various scorecard metrics. So what we'll start with here is a view of the generation mix. So this is one way of looking in the year 2030, how across these 4 different scenarios, the mix of generation resources might vary based on portfolio and based on market condition in each of these scenarios. So for graphical purposes, what we've pulled in together on this slide are just 3 portfolios, the 3 portfolios that either have all gas additions or a blend of gas and renewable additions to start with, and against each of the 4 scenarios. So we've got clusters of 3 portfolios times the 4 scenarios, just to give some visuals on what the different market impacts mean. So you've probably heard a lot of talk as we've gone through these scenarios. Well, it's got a higher gas price, it's got a lower or higher carbon price, and at the end of the day, those inputs impact the way that the portfolio performs and the way that the different resources that are in that portfolio dispatch. So for example, in the carbon-based economy scenario, that's the second cluster of 3 bars. Remember, we have no carbon price and we have low gas prices. Those type of market dynamics mean that gas-fired resources are going to be more attractive to run, are going to thus have higher dispatch in the ERCOT market. And that's what you see in the graphic. The blue bars tend to be a little bit higher. In those market conditions, portfolios that have more gas generation are going to be cheaper to operate, and they're going to produce more generation for the broader market. And we'll see how that rolls through the purchases and the cost implications. But this is one way of looking exact same portfolio, but it performs a little bit differently as you change the scenario variables. Second point here is in the VMA scenario, where we have high gas prices and no carbon price. You can see that gray bar that represents coal is the highest in that particular scenario in P4. So another example of the market conditions for carbon regulation, gas versus coal prices, altering the way that different resource types behave. So the renewable technology tends to be more stable because it's dependent just on the weather conditions and how much wind and solar is available. But you'll see that we have dispatch switching and changing between gas and coal across the scenarios. And that's one implication that we'll see once we get to some of the cost results. Next slide here shows the same view for those renewable dominant portfolios. So P3 and then P5 through P9 are all renewables. And what you can see, I think the takeaway here is that there's a lot more stability in those renewable dominant portfolios. And again, we'll see this show up a little bit from a cost perspective as well. So the overall generation, if you just look at the top of all the bars and how they compare across the scenarios, are generally in a similar range compared to the other 3 portfolios. But we can still see some of the changes in the blue bars that we referenced before. So in a low gas price environment like the carbon-based economy, you're going to see the blue bars be a little bit higher, a little bit greater, indicating more gas dispatch. And then on the flip side, if you've got higher gas prices, like in the volatile market scenario, that gas resource is going to dispatch a little bit less. And we'll show in a couple slides the impacts of that from a market purchases perspective. So like I said, lots of annual data behind the scenes as these models get run and the simulations are performed. But this is one way of giving at least a high level flavor, hopefully, of how the dispatch of different resources will vary by scenario and by portfolio, ultimately feeding the costs and the market purchases and the ultimate revenue requirements that we'll get to in a few minutes here. Another key metric that we've obviously focused on the scorecard are CO2 emissions. So this is the carbon emissions intensity in 2030. So it's the same year that we've been reporting on in the scorecard. And thus far, what we've reported in the October meeting is focused on the reference case. So those blue bars are showing the CO2 emissions intensity for each of the portfolios, the 9 portfolios across the board, in the reference case in 2030. And as you might recall, P1 and P4, especially P4 holding the coal units in service, P1 adding some additional gas combined cycle capacity, have the highest CO2 emissions. P6 and P7 have the lowest because they remove the coal units and they remove some of the combined cycle capacity that's currently in the portfolio by 2030. So that's kind of the reference case view. If you look across the 4 scenarios, the trends are very similar. You'll see them kind of moving across portfolio by portfolio, but a few things probably pop out. The CBE scenario, the carbon-based economy scenario, generally results in higher emission intensity for all the portfolios, or at least except for P4, which we'll talk about in a minute, because cheaper gas, no carbon penalty means that gas units are likely to run a little bit more, and thus the emission intensity of the portfolio, which has more gas running, is going to be a little bit higher. The net zero economy scenario in green through 2030 is actually pretty similar to the reference case. It has lower renewable costs, but the CO2 price there doesn't really ramp up until the 2030s and 2040s. So if we were to look at this in 2040, you see more differentiation, but it's pretty similar to the reference case in 2030. And then the VMA scenario, volatile market, tends to have the lowest emission rate for a lot of the portfolios, particularly because gas prices are high and gas dispatch would be down. But P4, which retains the coal plant, actually has the highest CO2 emission. So again, this is another dynamic here where if the market is such that gas prices are high and coal prices have not moved as much, coal resources are going to operate more at a higher capacity factor, and thus the emission intensity profile for the CPS Energy portfolio would be higher. So that brown bar in the VMA scenario, you can see tends to be lower for a lot of the portfolios, but P4 really jumps out as a higher one. So in the scorecard, we're continuing to report the CO2 emissions in the reference case as a good benchmark, and you can see it's a representative benchmark about how the portfolios compare against each other. But if you believe that any one of these other scenarios are more realistic, or you'd like to see what it looks like in any of the other scenarios, that's what this backup data is for, to give you a sense of what the range might be and some of the uncertainty, frankly, that we're dealing with. Next metric is market purchases. So this is something that also goes into the scorecard. And you can recall again that we focused on 2030 as a benchmark for how many purchases each of the portfolios is relying upon from the ERCOT market. As a benchmark, CPS Energy's total energy demand or retail sales tend to be about 35,000 gigawatt hours. So we're talking about anywhere between 0 to 6,000 gigawatt hours represented here by market purchase share. And you might recall in October, P6, P7 tend to have the highest market purchases due to more intermittent resources. But across the different scenarios, you can see a range. And again, this is very correlated to the dispatch graphics that we talked about a couple slides ago. When gas prices are low and gas units are running more, market purchases tend to be down. When the opposite is the case, market purchases tend to be up. And there's some variance depending on the composition of the portfolio. So again, I won't go through each bar in each slide, but the point here is that you've got variance across the scenarios, but we're going to focus from a scorecard perspective on the reference case, and then we'll also get to the extreme weather in a minute. So we'll dive into the extreme weather outcomes and then turn this into a more of a cost-based discussion. So first, we'll take a look at the extreme weather impacts from an ERCOT market perspective. And there's a few interesting graphics here, I think, that will hopefully highlight the pricing impacts and the potential market exposure that could exist under these conditions. So as a reminder, we're simulating winter events like Winter Storm Uri, summer events like the summer of 2011, and looking at what the ERCOT market might look like under current rules and expectations. The price cap has changed since the winter storm. And we're simulating that ERCOT market under those events and taking a look at how the CPS Energy portfolio might perform. So before we get to the portfolio performance, here's a quick snapshot of what the prices might look like. So this is an hourly graphic over the 10 days of that storm, extrapolated into 2030. The gray line shows the price volatility that happened in 2011. The blue line shows the simulated prices that we get in this market simulation with all the variables that we talked about: higher load, lower wind and solar and gas availability. And as a result, this is the type of market pricing condition that the portfolios would operate under. So there's obviously broader ERCOT reliability risk that exists beyond CPS Energy's control. But one way that hopefully this sensitivity will be valuable is give you a sense of the type of market exposure that you'd be faced with if resources within your portfolio or within CPS Energy's portfolio were not available. And that's why this market price forecast is important. From a summer perspective, you can see a different picture. We're now graphing all the hours in July on the left and August on the right, and just illustrating the fact that under conditions where demand is very high, we would expect to see much more volatile market prices than we do in the simple reference case scenario for 2030. So the reference case is shown in orange. You can barely see the lines there, but we're talking about $30, $50, $100 peak prices at times during the hot days. But in the event of very extreme weather, we could be seeing the type of events that we've seen in ERCOT over the years, where you get up to that $5,000 megawatt hour price cap, maybe 7 times in the month of August, because you've got an extended heat wave. And again, the exposure that may exist to portfolios that do not have enough generation to operate every hour or dispatchable generation to cover those peak hours will be shown in the financial analysis. So again, this is a stage setting slide for how the ERCOT market looks under this condition. So now we'll move into the CPS Energy portfolio under the extreme weather. This slide is going to look at the winter, and then the next slide will look at the summer. And what I think we should primarily focus on here is the market purchases and sales. And again, what we're looking at here is just a 10-day period in February for each of the 9 portfolios. We've got the reference scenario as the first bar, and then the extreme weather sensitivity as the second bar. And what you can see if you compare those 2 bars is wind output is expected to be lower as a result of the actual performance that we saw in the storm Uri. Solar output's expected to be a little bit lower because of the weather conditions in a snowy, cloudy, cold week like this one. And to the extent that gas generation is available, particularly in portfolios that have more gas generation, even though there are outages simulated due to fuel supply issues, there could be additional gas that's dispatched for portfolios 1 and 2 and 4, for example. So you'll see those blue bars in those portfolios make up some of the difference. The brown bars, shaded or hatched on the top, represent market purchases. And I think one of the key takeaways here in the portfolios that rely more on intermittent resources and storage as a backup at various durations are subject to higher levels of market purchases in the extreme weather sensitivity than those that have much more dispatchable natural gas-fired capacity. So for example, P3, P5 to 9, you can see the brown hatched bars at the top are quite a bit greater in the extreme weather sensitivity when compared to the reference case. And that's one way of showing the exposure that exists for those portfolios from an ERCOT market perspective. In the summer, we have a similar picture. It's not quite as dramatic. We're now looking at the 2 months of July and August of 2030 in the hot heat wave simulation. And again, what you'll see are a couple things. First of all, the load on average is going to be higher, and the portfolios have to meet that with a mix of their own resources or market purchases. So in this instance, we don't have an erosion of solar and wind and gas availability, but instead we just have higher demand and higher market prices. And in general, those portfolios that do not have dispatchable resources to pick up the slack for when demand is high and when the market prices are really high are going to be exposed to higher levels of market purchase. So again, the brown hatch on the top, the size of that bar is going to be a little bit higher for portfolios that tend to rely more on intermittent resources. When you take those 2 graphics and kind of combine them up into a comparison of gross market purchases across the year, and then as a percentage of total load, you get this picture. Overall, I think the important deltas that we're looking at are between the reference scenario and the extreme weather scenario. You can see for a couple of the portfolios, including P1 and P2 and P4, the gross market purchases are actually going down in the extreme weather scenario because they have more gas capacity, more coal capacity that could respond to those market signals and be available to cover in the event of high loads and high market prices. Whereas in portfolios P6 and P7, for example, they have the largest increase in market purchase due to their relatively renewable heavy capacity mix and reliance on things such as short duration storage. So storage may very well be available to pick up the slack during many hours, but if you have an elongated event of more than 4 or 8 hours that a battery can cover, those portfolios are going to be more exposed to the market. So that summarizes the key elements associated with kind of the stage setting to get to the costs. Hopefully, most of that made sense to give a sense of how the portfolio dispatch changes, how the emissions change, how the market purchases are going to change under each of these conditions. And then the next section is going to try to put that all together into the financial affordability metrics that we've been referencing and aiming at here to get into the scorecard. So before I get into the details here, I want to lay out a few assumptions. And as I said at the outset, the CPS Energy financial team is available for detailed questions as you get into some of the underlying data here. But what we'll talk about in the next couple of slides are a summary of the revenue requirements, the costs per megawatt hour, and the bill impacts associated with each of the 9 portfolios against each of the 4 scenarios and the sensitivity for extreme weather. But a few assumptions that I think are quite important to point out. First of all, under this analysis, all rate groups and rate structures remain as they are today. So new rates may be implemented as part of the rate redesign process that I know is underway and will be happening into the new year. But for purposes of this analysis, the status quo rate structures are in place, and those are assumed to come up with the bill impact data that you'll see. Points 2 and 3, as we've been talking about in the past, market purchases and sales are an important part of this analysis, and we assume in this analysis that CPS Energy is able to buy all needed energy at the time of expected purchase and sell excess energy at the time when you have excess at the prices within the market forecasts that have been developed. Those are obviously best guess forecasts under different states of the world and the extreme weather sensitivity where we try to stress test things. But that's an input assumption. In reality, you may not be able to sell all the energy at a particular price that we're looking at. There could be local congestion issues. There could be other dynamics in the market that change the price either that you're purchasing or selling. So that's just a risk to keep in mind that underlies some of the uncertainty here. Fourth point, non-energy markets remain close to current conditions. So that is referring particularly to the cost to borrow, fixed costs such as labor costs, things like a recession or a current inflationary environment accelerating that would impact the cost of debt, for example, could impact some of the calculations here. That has not been simulated. And instead, we're kind of looking at current conditions as we build up the costs. And then finally, we've hinted at this topic a few times in the past. Transmission system impacts are uncertain, particularly around local generation retirements or new builds in terms of when the ERCOT market would allow for a retirement for local reliability purposes on the transmission system, or if there were transmission upgrades for reliability purposes that might be required beyond the current assumptions. Those haven't been embedded particularly specifically in the analysis. So again, keep that in mind as an uncertainty. So the next set of slides are going to step through the revenue requirements, and then we'll get to bills and ultimately dollar per megawatt hour costs. And we'll try to take this methodically. There's a lot of data, as I keep saying, for each of the portfolios against each of the scenarios and sensitivities that we're looking at. But we'll start with a revenue requirement view. On the left-hand side is the short term, so 2023 to 2030. The right-hand side is the long term, 2023 all the way through 2047, so the 25-year time period. And it's the present value of revenue requirements. So the revenue requirement simply means the total cost of serving generation service for CPS Energy's customers. So it doesn't include certain elements that are outside the generation mix. And a present value is just a way of discounting all the future requirements to today's dollars. So it uses a standard discount rate to put everything into an apples to apples comparison. And for graphic purposes, what we've got is the 9 portfolios from left to right, P1 to P9, and then we're simply plotting the revenue requirement over that 7 to 8 year period and then over the 25-year period for each of the 9 portfolios. So a few takeaways. First of all, P6 and P7 have the highest revenue requirements, primarily due to the addition of relatively high cost renewables, including geothermal capacity to replace existing combined cycle gas. So you'll recall P6 and P7 have the most aggressive retirement schedules, not only retiring the Spruce units, but also 2 of CPS Energy's existing natural gas combined cycles by 2030. Question?
On the
Thank you. On P6 and P7, having the highest revenue requirements due to the addition of high-cost geothermal capacity. If we didn't have the high-cost geothermal capacity and just included what I had asked for in terms of the portfolios, just wind, solar, energy efficiency, and battery storage, would the revenue requirements have been lower if we took out geothermal? Because I didn't add geothermal into my portfolios.
Yeah, we haven't run that specific case, but I think.
But that is the
geothermal
case that I had asked to run.
Geothermal is one element of it. We also would have to oversize the storage to get a certain amount of reliability. So
Sure.
it would also be higher cost. So I think either way, whether it's got a little, it's only about 25 megawatts of geothermal, whether it has that or additional sized storage, I think we'd be in the similar ballpark. Because you've got a lot of capacity from wind, solar, and storage that has to replace the gas.
All right.
Okay, let's go ahead.
So P1, P4, and P9 tend to have the lowest revenue requirements. So P1 relies on new, lower cost gas capacity primarily to meet future demand without any additional renewables. So that's another way of kind of looking at the flip side. If there were no renewables and new storage added beyond the flex power bundle, we tend to be closer to P1. P4 has lower future capacity additions because both Spruce units remain in service, and then P9 benefits from Spruce 2 conversion to gas and defers some new capacity additions. So within those portfolios, we've got a range between what tend to come out to be the three lowest and the two highest. One other observation, as you look from the left-hand to the right-hand graphic, the trends are generally similar. You'll see a little bit of difference in the shape, but the main higher cost resources versus the lower cost resources, or portfolios, I should say, tend to order out generally the same. So the last bullet here, portfolios are more sensitive to changing market conditions. Certain ones are more sensitive to others, and that's what we'll step through on the next couple of slides, where we bring in on that exact template the different scenarios. So we'll start with the CBE scenario. Those are being shown in the blue circle. So this is the scenario that has no carbon price, low gas prices. Overall, this is generally a scenario that's going to lower the cost for every portfolio because every portfolio has some amount of natural gas in it. Some of them have less than others, so you'll see the impacts be a little bit less impactful, particular P6 and P7, which get rid of the most natural gas. But overall, portfolio costs are going to go down. And the difference between the black circles and the blue circles is going to be widest or greatest for the portfolios that have the most gas. So if you're relying more heavily on natural gas and natural gas prices are lower than what you expect, and there's no carbon burden associated with those emissions, the portfolio costs would be expected to be lower. And you can see that most prominently in P1, and you can see the delta between the black and the blue circles tends to grow over time for those portfolios that are more reliant on gas, whereas P6 and P7 are very similar because they don't have a lot of gas in the portfolio. So everything else that's been purchased or acquired associated with the wind, the solar, the storage, the geothermal is locked in and not susceptible to gas market uncertainty. The green triangles represent the net zero economy scenario. So you'll notice a few things. In the near term, that scenario also results in lower costs for all the portfolios across the board because that scenario is dependent on lower renewable technology costs. So pretty much everything is adding some amount of renewables. P6 and P7 that add the most renewables, you can see the decline in those costs associated with cheaper geothermal, cheaper wind, cheaper solar, cheaper storage. They still have a small premium associated with a lot of the other portfolios, but we see a bigger impact in that lower cost associated with the NZE scenario. Over the long term, the carbon price really kicks in, and that's where we start to see some more differentiation. So particularly with portfolios that have a lot of carbon emissions, such as P4, which retains the coal, P1, which has a lot of natural gas, you'll see the green triangle above the black dot. So some different dynamics over time, but overall that portfolio or that scenario tends to advantage portfolios that have more renewables than natural gas and coal, at least from a relative perspective. And then finally, slide is getting a little busy here with all the scenarios, but what we've now added on top of those three scenarios is the VMA shown in the blue diamonds and the extreme weather sensitivity in that orange line there. So start with the VMA. You'll recall this has high renewable costs and high natural gas prices. So right off the bat, with the exception of maybe portfolio 5 and portfolio 9, that market condition is going to result in higher costs for all the portfolios. We have higher gas prices, so portfolios that are relying on burning gas are going to have higher costs, and we have higher renewable costs. So portfolios that have a lot of new renewables, any type of renewable or storage, are also going to have higher costs. Over the long term, we see the dynamics shift a little bit. The portfolios that rely more and more on those renewables, you'll see the deltas going up in the upper direction, P3, P6, P7, P5, whereas P4, which retains the coal, is in the best position under these market conditions. So remember from an earlier slide, coal generation is highest in this situation. High renewable costs, high natural gas prices. It's effectively a scenario where having coal in the portfolio hedges against that. And you'll see the blue diamond in P4 tending to be actually right on top of the original reference case, whereas you see a lot of upward pressure due to gas prices or renewable costs in all the other portfolios. And then finally, the orange line here represents the extreme weather sensitivity. So remember, this is just done for 1 year. So as we look out over a 25-year period, the impact of that one anomalous year tends to be muted. So we'll focus more on the left-hand side. The delta, again, between the black circle and the orange line is going to represent the impact or the present value of the impact of just that 1 year of extreme weather on the portfolio. And what we can see is the biggest impact for P3, P5, and P5 to 9 all together. They have different impacts relative to how much dispatchable and non-dispatchable resource they have in the portfolio, whereas the smaller impacts are associated with P1, P2, and P4. So this ties right back to that market purchases concept that we reviewed before. In an extreme weather situation, we have high load, very high market prices, and if you don't have the resources available to operate in those conditions, the portfolio will be subject to more and more market purchases. If you do have the resources that can ramp up and respond to those conditions, you could actually have additional sales back to the market and potentially mitigate the cost increases. So very quickly, this slide is really a carbon copy of the prior slide, but showing bill impacts. So won't spend a lot of time going into the details, but the point here is that we've taken all that revenue requirement analysis and translated it into a dollar per month bill impact for residential customers. This is done on a baseline to the latest rate request information that the finance team has put together. So everything here is incremental to the finance team's latest baseline associated with the rate request. So there's different ways of looking at this. The way that it's been done here is to baseline to that current budget case, if you will, and the rate request, and then take a look at deltas up and down off of that. So I won't rehash all the themes. You can kind of see the relationships still the same across each of the portfolios and each of the scenarios, but just wanted to note that that's the baseline condition. So putting everything now into a dollar per megawatt hour perspective, this graphic is going to show each of the 5 scenario sensitivity permutations that we just walked through. And we're looking at the average cost per megawatt hour for the generation portion of the system's cost for each of the portfolios. In the reference scenario, portfolios with earlier retirements of fossil capacity generally are less affordable, but you can see a range across the board. In the carbon-based economy scenario, portfolios benefit from lower market energy and natural gas prices, particularly P1. So you can see the position of P1, which is gas dominant, is best in that scenario. In the NZE, net zero economy scenario, all portfolios generally actually perform better at least through 2030, which is what we're showing here in the reference case, because we have cheaper renewable costs and the carbon impact hasn't really hit for the carbon intense portfolios. And the portfolios that have more renewables, P5 and P8, kind of jump out as moving into that lighter shaded territory, benefit the most. In the volatile market scenario, all portfolios are impacted by those higher gas and renewable prices, but you get a little bit of hedging benefit, as I mentioned, from P4. And then finally, in the extreme weather sensitivity, most portfolios are impacted by higher prices, but some portfolios provide better price protection. So the portfolios that have that dispatchable energy, particularly P1, P2, P4, tend to be less exposed to that extreme weather condition. And speaking of that, this graphic here now puts some of that into the scorecard perspective and gives you a sense of the magnitude from a revenue requirement just in 2030 perspective. So we've highlighted in that blue box the two metrics associated with extreme weather exposure. First, the revenue requirement in 2030, and then secondly, the market purchases. Again, the shading, the darker color tends to be a less favorable outcome. And as we've indicated here before, P1, P2, and P4 generally are able to offset the higher fuel costs in extreme weather by selling excess power in the ERCOT market and mitigating that extra cost that otherwise would come from that type of situation, whereas P3, P5, P6, P7 are most exposed. Those are the portfolios that have the darker shading. And for some perspective here, we're looking at billions of dollars of revenue requirement in that 2030 forecast year, and we've got a spread of about 1.5 billion or so between the high and the low. So that gives you a sense of the portfolios that might perform best versus those that are most exposed. That's the type of risk that we're trying to quantify in that single year associated with that revenue requirement. From a market purchases perspective, very similar in terms of the shadings or the trade-offs that we're seeing. P1 and P2 have the lowest market purchases exposure. They do right off the bat, but they also retain it in the extreme weather condition, whereas P6 and P7 have the highest, and then the rest kind of fall in between. So very quickly, this is just a rundown of everything that's in the supporting packet. I won't read the bullets here, but I just wanted to highlight what's in that supporting data pack. And then before we wrap up with the integrated scorecard, I'll try to go very quickly through the other two sensitivities associated with STEP and build versus buy. So we referenced this before. I think a couple questions had come up from Dr. Femi on the impacts, or maybe it was Peter, on the impacts associated with STEP, where we have the change to the portfolio mixes with the enhanced STEP or the reduced STEP. So this graphic is showing in P4 or P6, if we have the enhanced STEP program, how much less capacity is now needed because we have less demand to serve, or if we have the reduced STEP program, how much more capacity is needed. So we're talking about on the order of 400 megawatts or so of total capacity that would either be pulled out of the portfolio or brought into the portfolio if you had more or less energy efficiency. So you can see we're doing these bookend cases to try to look at what would happen if we took out gas, RICE units, or if we took out a mix of hydrogen and storage units in P6. And then the next slide here gives a sense of what the impacts are. So there's a few takeaways here. Number one, CO2 emissions are down if you have more STEP, and they're up slightly if you have less STEP. We're talking about on the order of magnitude of maybe 3% or so, and the impacts are going to be less sensitive in the P6 portfolio because we're already having a lot of renewables, so we're not really changing the mix there if we take storage in or out. But if you're adding gas, you're going to have an impact of about 3 or 4% on the CO2 emissions. We're going to move from about 9 or 10% of energy associated with the STEP down to 8% or up to 11.5%. So that's the order of magnitude on the total contribution that we're talking about. And then in terms of the cost impact, we're seeing about a $442 million present value saving over the 25-year period for the enhanced STEP in the P4 scenario, and over $500 million in the P6 portfolio, I should say. Just for reference, the baseline revenue requirement or present value over that 25-year period is about 25 billion. So we're talking about $500 million savings, maybe it's a few percent, couple percent on that total, but a material impact. And at a high level, what we're finding is enhanced step over the 25-year period has a present value benefit to the portfolio. So there is overall savings from an aggregate cost perspective associated with less megawatt hours to serve and less capacity needed to serve peak demand. It gets a little bit more nuanced in the P6 reduced scenario. So I'll save some of this detailed commentary maybe for a follow-up session. But one of the takeaways we have here is that there may be some different value between capacity and energy resources depending on the mix of resources that are in your portfolio. So if you're relying more on renewables and long duration storage, a STEP program that is designed differently to have different impacts on the energy or the peak demand needs might be differently performing than if you're relying on more gas capacity. So that may be somewhat intuitive, but getting into the weeds would require a lot of follow-up probably on some of the annual performance. But I think the main takeaway is the enhanced step is showing portfolio savings regardless of whether you're looking at the P4 or the P6 portfolio. And then finally, the build versus buy sensitivity. We've got P4 as our showcase here. And as I mentioned before, the buy sensitivity is going to push everything into a PPA. And that's going to generally raise costs because you're going to not be able to take advantage of lower cost of capital for CPS Energy if you're procuring from a third party. So you can see in the buy sensitivity, higher average rates, higher revenue requirements, and then a greater impact on CPS Energy workforce, so more employees potentially being impacted, and then less capital being invested in the local economy. So again, overall, the metrics are going to be worse, I would say, for the buy sensitivity, but these are the order of magnitude of the trade-offs that you might want to consider. So I'll try to wrap up in 5 minutes here just to do a quick rundown of the scorecard. Won't go through the metrics again because we've looked at that before, but this is the summary. So we've shown part of this back in October and now we've filled everything out. I think one of the takeaways here is that there's a lot of trade-offs to look at. We have not attempted to quantify a final scoring for any particular portfolio in this view. There may be ways that you could do that. Different members may have different perspectives on which of the objectives are most important. But what this hopefully will show is a data set that provides a quick review of some of those key trade-offs. Different portfolios are going to perform differently under different objectives. And some portfolios may provide middle-of-the-road performance across many objectives. Some portfolios might be really good in certain objectives, but might have risks in others. And then the supporting slides that we've got in this section just do a little bit of a deeper dive into each one. I'll run through them very quickly. We hit on a lot of this actually in the October meeting. So this is the system reliability and climate resiliency. We talked about diversity and how P8 and P9 have a more diverse set of resources than P1, which is more dominated by gas. So that's something to keep in mind. We talked about reserve margin generally being in that 13 to 15% range, but P6 and P7 turning over a large portion of the fleet could have potential issues associated with having enough capacity to come into the system in time, or general uncertainty on some of those ELCC reliability reserve margin metrics that we were talking about earlier. And then from an extreme weather exposure perspective, we recapped this a few slides ago, but generally speaking, P1, P2, and to some extent P4 perform quite a lot better in that extreme weather sensitivity than P6 and P7. And then the other renewable dominant portfolios tend to fall in the middle. From an environmental sustainability perspective, this slide is very similar to what we shared in October, with the one caveat that we have added market purchases into the emission intensity. So if you notice differences in the numbers versus October, that's the reason for it. As we note over to the right, by 2030, P2, P3, and P5 through 9 all outperform the 2030 cap target of a 41% emission reduction, that's 543 pounds per megawatt hour. P1 and P4 would not meet that 2030 target without additional mitigation. And then you can see in 2040, we have a similar list, although P1, P2, and P4, those three would not meet the 2040 target without additional mitigation. So that could include changes in fuel or different adjustments to the portfolio as we've outlined now, but this gives you a sense of how these 9 portfolios shape up over those 2 projection periods. From an affordability perspective, this is a summary of what we looked at before, but I will point out that we have ranges being shown here, and the shading is based on the width of the range. So it's one way of looking at it. Again, there's a lot of backup data. You can interpret it in different ways, but one way of, we hope, of showing this is that a portfolio could have higher overall costs, but it could have a smaller range, even at a higher baseline, that would mitigate your future uncertainty or risk. So for example, P6 and P7 do have the highest overall costs from a dollar per megawatt hour basis from a revenue requirement perspective. But as we talked about before, they're locking in a lot of their energy into fixed renewable costs and might be less subject to uncertainty in gas prices or uncertainty in carbon prices. So that's why you see a little bit of a minor or a lower range for some of those resources. Otherwise, you can see trade-offs between P1, P4, P9 tending to show up as the top 3 portfolios from a pure cost perspective. System flexibility, this has not changed since October. So the takeaways that we had here are that P1 and P2 have more dispatchable capacity, less reliance on the market, whereas P6, P7 have less dispatchable capacity and more reliance on the market. So up to 18% of total energy in 2030 is met by market purchases, and that provides a risk. And then from a workforce impact, very similar to what we looked at in October, but we've shifted some of the numbers on the employees. The portfolios that retain more capacity or build resources such as combined cycles or new gas capacity that needs to be staffed by CPS Energy employees tend to do better than those that retire most capacity. And then the local economic impact will depend on how much capacity is being built locally in the San Antonio region. So portfolios that build local gas or local hydrogen or local geothermal projects are going to have more investment into the local community and hence will perform better. So final slide that we have is really an overview of some key portfolio risk characteristics. This maps somewhat to the overall scorecard, but as you're looking at some of the uncertainties and some of the risks that you might want to keep in mind, we thought this view might be somewhat instructive. It's qualitative, but gives you a sense from a short-term bill and long-term bill volatility perspective. We've got some trade-offs. There's not a whole lot of volatility in the near term, but certain portfolios, particularly those that offer up a lot of renewable capacity and may limit the amount of new gas in the market, could be less exposed to gas price uncertainty. Gas price uncertainty could be a good thing if you have very low gas prices, but it does introduce volatility in the near term. Over the long term, we have a little bit of a different picture there. I think P1 we would characterize as having the highest bill impact volatility, again, because it becomes very dominated by natural gas resources. So you're subject to commodity price, carbon price risk, whereas a few of the others that might go more heavily in the renewable direction, such as P6 and P7, might move from a low to a medium bill volatility perspective as we have a portfolio that gets more concentrated in another type of resource. And then reliance on ERCOT and extreme weather cost. This maps fairly well to the extreme weather sensitivity and the market purchases metrics that we talked about. Generally speaking, the resources that have more dispatchable, controllable capacity that can operate at higher capacity factors when it needs to are going to have less reliance on purchases from the ERCOT market and are going to have an ability to hedge against those extreme weather events and limit the amount of exposure that may come from those events, whereas portfolios that are more dominated by intermittent resources or shorter or mid-duration storage capacity may not have the ability to react on demand and meet the uncertainties that might exist in an extreme weather event. So I'll take a break there. I guess we're right at time. And Reed, I don't know if you want to open it up or if you have any thoughts.
Well, it's 6 o'clock. I think if folks want to stay and ask questions, they can. If they want to defer their questions to our online sessions, the two-hour sessions, I'm sure we'll have. I'm sure y'all will be on the call, and so will Burns and Max. So it's up to the folks here. Boy, it's getting dark early. Okay. Do I see any folks here that want to speak? And then I'll see if there's somebody queuing in from online. Okay, I got Femi here, and then who do I have online? Okay, I've got Femi and then Dana. So I know people have families to take care of. So if y'all want to scoot, please feel free. You won't offend me.
Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to ask only one of my 4 questions. Actually 5 before. But first of all, let me commend CRA for doing a wonderful job, not only with summarizing this information, but also providing the data, which many of us would certainly like to knock ourselves out and, dig into at some point. So thanks for doing that. I think that's really what we've been looking for, to say it's not just you presenting the results, but us seeing some of the numbers behind the results. And I think I also want to see the methodology, but we'll get to that at some other time. I want to just point out something which I think struck me as you were presenting slide 39. And this is something that would really be of interest to Rick Luna, because at a previous board meeting, there was a concern about the STEP program and the objectives of that program. I think that final bullet speaks directly to those questions or those thoughts that were expressed by a couple of board members. I believe Trustee Romero might have been the one that brought this up as to what is the objective of the STEP. Is it an energy objective or is it a capacity objective? That I think speaks directly to that. Of course, it's something that could draw some more discussions, but I think this is really revealing some of the importance of defining the objective of the STEP program and how that fits into all the generation planning, the whole generation planning process. So again, wonderful job. And I think this is a very important insight. Thanks.
I think we got one more. Dana, are you there?
I'm still here, but I can defer till next time, I don't have a problem.
All right, and let's all try to, if we can, clear our schedules to make this next question session. I know we've all got several. However, if you have questions, please put them in an email and get those to Ann, and that will help facilitate and organize and make our meeting a little more efficient, okay? Now remember, when we come back in each one of those 2 sessions, we will have the presentations of the charts on the cost models, which Chad and his folks have done, okay? If there's nothing else, we're adjourned. Thank you.